Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. Ethan hadn't expected much on that cold autumn night. The clock on his dashboard blinked 2:37 a.m. as his worn-out Toyota cruised down a nearly deserted stretch of road, the tires humming softly on the cracked asphalt. His stomach churned from exhaustion, but his fingers tightened around the wheel, guiding the car through the endless fog that had descended like a heavy, damp blanket. Every so often the fog seemed to breathe, shifting and swirling with a life of its own, suffocating the air and closing off his view of the road ahead. He had been driving rideshare for the past few months, a decision born out of necessity rather than choice. A life left behind, a dream abandoned, and now the routine of late-night pickups and drops had become a kind of monotonous solace. The hum of the engine, the glow of the dashboard, the weight of the loneliness. It was familiar, predictable. The phone buzzed. The bright screen illuminated his tired face, the passenger request flashing before his eyes like an unsettling invitation. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before tapping the accept button. The address was strange, a street name he didn't recognize in a neighborhood he hadn't driven through before. It seemed to lead off the main road into a more remote part of the countryside, and there was something unsettling about it, something that gnawed at him, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He sighed, pushing aside the unease. A ride was a ride. At this hour, he'd take anything to make up for the slow night. The phone buzzed again with an update. Passenger awaiting pickup. The GPS on the screen showed a long stretch of road barely lit with thick trees lining either side. Ethan glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see some kind of ghostly figure standing in the fog, but the back seat was empty. A shiver crawled up his spine, but it was probably just the cold seeping through the cracks in the window. He drove, his headlights cutting through the fog, casting long shadows that seemed to dance just out of the corner of his eye. The feeling in the pit of his stomach grew gnawing, though he couldn't explain why. The road ahead was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made you aware of the smallest sound. The soft hum of his tires on the road, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant croak of an unseen animal. Nothing else. And then he saw it, standing alone at the side of the road, just beyond the reach of his headlights. The figure, a man, tall, gaunt, and draped in a long, dark coat, standing unnervingly still in the thick fog. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but Ethan could make out his hands, white and trembling, hanging by his sides. There was no movement except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, as though the man had been waiting for him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his eyes fixed ahead, his grip tightening on the wheel as he slowed to a stop beside him. The man didn't look up as Ethan rolled down the window, the air outside clammy, damp. "Need a ride?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking the silence yet sounding strange to his own ears. Forced, unfamiliar. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slid into the back seat, the door creaking slightly as it shut behind him. Ethan felt his heart race, but he kept his face neutral as he glanced at the rearview mirror. The man sat there, motionless, his eyes hidden in shadow, not even a hint of acknowledgement. There was no hello or thank you, not even a nod. The silence was thick, oppressive. Ethan shifted in his seat, glancing at the GPS to confirm the address once more. He couldn't shake the sense of wrongness, in the air as though something was slightly off, just out of reach. Where to? Ethan asked, trying again to break the quiet, though the words came out with an edge of forced politeness. The man's voice, low and distant, barely audible, filled the car. West Pine Avenue. Ethan's fingers stiffened around the wheel, the name unfamiliar to him. He typed it into his phone, but it didn't come up in the system. A small pang of unease made its way into his chest. He tried to ignore it, blaming the late hour, the fog, the exhaustion. His phone buzzed again with a notification, but when he looked at it, the screen was blank, just a white space with no updates, no new information. He glanced up at the rearview mirror again. The man was still sitting there, staring blankly out the window, unmoving. His presence filled the car, thick with a coldness that seeped into Ethan's bones, making the already chilly air seem even colder. Ethan cleared his throat. "Is that your address?" he asked again, but the words felt wrong now. His own voice sounded distant, like he wasn't speaking to the man at all, but to some unseen presence that hung heavy in the air between them. The passenger didn't answer. His silence felt like a weight, pressing down on Ethan, thickening the atmosphere inside the car. Ethan wanted to speak again, but something stopped him. He felt the tightness in his chest grow, his breathing shallow. It wasn't just the fog outside, it was something else, something inside the car. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The road stretched on, longer than it should have. Every turn felt like it led deeper into the darkness, the fog pressing closer. The car's headlights barely cut through the mist, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine, filling the silence that had settled between them. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the car's speed slowing as they ventured further away from the last signs of civilization. Ethan's eyes flickered nervously to the rearview mirror. Still, the man sat there, unmoving, his face hidden beneath the hood. For a brief moment, Ethan caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass, pale, wide-eyed, a thin sheen of sweat dotting his forehead. He quickly looked away, not wanting to acknowledge the unease settling in his stomach. Where was he going? Who was this man? The silence in the car seemed to deepen, becoming thick, suffocating. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his nerves on edge. It felt as though the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound. Ethan's mind raced, chasing thoughts he couldn't grasp. The road twisted ahead, and the fog seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, until the world outside was swallowed by a grey nothingness. Then, as if to punctuate the unease, the man's voice broke through the quiet, barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wonder how you got here?" The words chilled Ethan to the bone. The question, so simple yet so unsettling. He stared at the fog in front of him, forcing himself to focus, to drive, to not let his mind spiral into the endless, suffocating darkness surrounding him. The road ahead seemed endless, curving and twisting with no end in sight. The man's voice came again, this time louder. "Do you ever wonder if you're still alive?" Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. The question lodged itself in his mind, refusing to be ignored. His breath quickened as a sudden sharp chill filled the car. The fog, now so dense it pressed against the windows, blocked any view beyond the headlights, and the air inside the car seemed to grow colder with each passing second. "Almost there," Ethan whispered to himself, trying to convince himself the tension was all in his head. The man didn't answer. The fog seemed to grow thicker as Ethan drove deeper into the woods, enveloping everything in a dense, suffocating haze. His headlights barely cut through the whiteness, and the road ahead twisted unnaturally, winding through the trees as though leading him into an unknown realm. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, unnatural, almost like a presence was lingering just beyond the edge of his vision. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, but he kept his focus ahead, gripping the wheel tightly. He stole another glance at the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. The passenger still hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word since his chilling question. Ethan's eyes flicked back to the road, trying to shake off the sense of unease building in his chest. The fog seemed alive, almost as if it were watching, them closing in on the car like a predator slowly tightening its grip. The man in the back seat remained eerily still, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. Only his hands, pale and long, rested motionless on his lap, his fingers curling slightly like a person in deep thought. It was as if the world outside no longer existed for him, just a distant blur to be ignored. And yet, the silence he emanated seemed to echo in the car, amplifying the already unnatural quiet that hung between them. Ethan tried to make sense of it. Was the passenger real? He didn't know. Something felt off about the situation, but what choice did he have but to drive forward? He could turn around, he supposed, but that would only feel more paranoid, more absurd. He was simply doing his job, driving the man to his destination. Yet, the longer the ride went on, the more Ethan couldn't shake the growing dread that gripped his heart. The man's words from earlier lingered in the air like a poisonous cloud. Do you ever wonder how you got here? And do you ever wonder if you're still alive? Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. No, he couldn't think about that. He couldn't let his mind wander. But the questions gnawed at him. How had he ended up here? A part of him couldn't remember how the night had started. Was he really alive? He had been moving on autopilot for so long, surviving, working, trying to keep everything together. But in that moment, as the fog pressed down on the car, Ethan wondered if there was something more to this ride, something he couldn't understand yet. Ahead, the road curved sharply, disappearing into the mist. There was a soft, hollow sound, the distant cry of an owl, perhaps, or something else. Ethan couldn't place it, but the sound scraped against the walls of his mind like nails on a chalkboard. His eyes darted back to the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of movement, any trace of the passenger's presence. He should have said something, anything to break the silence, to ground himself in reality. But the words didn't come. The man's silence had grown oppressive, suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on the atmosphere inside the car. Ethan's eyes flicked to the passenger again. This time the man was staring directly at him through the mirror, his face still shrouded in shadow. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked with the reflection of the man's gaze. It wasn't just cold. It was empty, hollow. There was no warmth, no humanity in those eyes. Only an endless void. A part of him wanted to look away, but his body refused. It was as though the man's gaze held him captive, frozen in place. Ethan's heartbeat quickened, echoing in his ears as he fought to breathe. And then the fog around them thickened. It rolled in from all sides, a wall of mist that pressed against the car, obscuring everything beyond the headlights. The sound of the engine seemed muffled now, distant, as if the car was moving through some kind of strange void. The man spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost a whisper, as though he were speaking directly into Ethan's soul. "You're not alone. You know." The words were soft, but they rang through Ethan's mind with the weight of a hammer strike. Not alone. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end, and for a moment, he couldn't remember if the man had said something else before. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened as the fog pressed harder against the car, its tendrils creeping along the edges of the windshield, blurring his vision. He glanced at the GPS again, but the screen had gone black. No address, no route, nothing. Just a blank void that mirrored the one that seemed to surround them. Panic set in, rising like a tide, as the oppressive silence continued to hold him in place. Suddenly, the sound of the car's tires on the road grew more pronounced. Ethan could feel the wheels gripping the pavement more sharply now, as though The car was speeding up without him even pressing the accelerator. He didn't remember his foot touching the gas pedal, but the speedometer continued to climb, the needle creeping upward with terrifying speed. "Stop," Ethan muttered under his breath, but the car wouldn't respond. The engine roared, the fog thickening, wrapping around the car like an iron grip. "Let me out," Ethan's voice cracked, trembling. He tried to slow the car, but the brake pedal wouldn't depress. The car seemed to have a mind of its own, now pulling him forward into the mist, dragging him deeper into the void. He glanced at the rearview mirror once more. The back seat was empty. The man was gone. For a moment, the confusion twisted inside Ethan's chest, knotting up in a ball of disbelief. He slammed his foot on the brake, the car lurching forward as it finally responded to his desperate commands. The vehicle jerked to a stop, the headlights illuminating nothing but thick, impenetrable fog. The sudden stillness in the car was deafening. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he sat there, heart pounding, eyes darting across the interior of the car. There was no sign of the man, no trace of him at all, just the echo of his voice in Ethan's mind, his words, "You're not alone." The voice still lingered, as though the man had never left. Ethan turned off the engine, and the car's silence grew deeper, the fog outside pressing against the windows like a living thing. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, and checked the app. His heart sank. The ride wasn't logged. There was no passenger, no trip, no history, nothing. A cold sweat broke out on Ethan's forehead. He checked again. No record of the fare, no trace of the man, no confirmation. There was nothing. Just the blank screen staring back at him, the void mocking him. Panic swelled in his chest as the words repeated in his mind. "You're not alone." It was too much. Ethan's fingers trembled as he looked at the dark road ahead of him, the fog pressing in from all sides. The air inside the car was thick, cold, and he realized with a start that the temperature had dropped dramatically. Then it hit him, the smell. The musty, rotten stench of decay creeping through the air, growing stronger by the second. The smell wasn't from the fog. It wasn't from the outside world. It was inside the car, thick and suffocating, like the air in an abandoned house long forgotten by time. Ethan gasped, and in that instant, his eyes darted to the rearview mirror. There, just behind him, he saw it. The reflection of something that hadn't been there before, a figure, the man, but not the way he had been before. This time his face was clearer, his features more defined, and his eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, seemed to burn through Ethan's soul. He wasn't just sitting there now. He was standing, towering over Ethan, his face twisted into a grotesque expression of pure malice. And then the man spoke. "Welcome home." Ethan couldn't breathe. The figure in the rearview mirror was so close now. It felt as if the man was standing just behind him, his presence pressing into the air, suffocating him from every angle. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring into Ethan's soul like a dark abyss, a void that would swallow him whole if he looked too long. His heart pounded in his chest, too fast, too loud. Sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his eyes. The air in the car was cold, unnaturally so, and his breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. But even as his fear spiraled, he couldn't bring himself to look away from the mirror. Something compelled him, something that wasn't just fear. It was a pull, a force that tightened around his chest, dragging his focus back to the reflection of the man who stood there, eyes burning through him. "Welcome home," the words echoed in Ethan's mind, vibrating in the space around him, as if they were coming from all directions at once. The man's lips barely moved as he spoke, but the words felt real, heavy. Ethan's fingers clutched the steering wheel, so tightly that his knuckles turned white, but no matter how hard he tried to steer, the car didn't respond. The road ahead stretched on, endlessly winding through the fog that grew thicker by the second. The man's presence was palpable now. His form was becoming clearer in the reflection, no longer just a shadow in the mist, but an actual solid figure. His tall frame seemed to press against the very walls of the car, bending the space around him. Ethan's gaze was locked onto the rearview mirror, unable to tear his eyes away from the hollow, empty face of the man. He tried to speak, tried to demand an explanation, but no words came. His throat was dry, his voice lost somewhere deep inside him. The man in the mirror shifted, moving closer, and Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. His pulse hammered in his ears, and then he spoke again, the voice no longer a whisper, but a deep, gravelly tone that seemed to reverberate through the car. "I know who you are, Ethan. I know what you've done." The word struck him like a slap. Ethan froze, his blood running cold. How did he know his name? What was this? How was this even happening? He jerked his head forward, tearing his gaze away from the mirror, only to find that the fog outside the car had thickened even more. The headlights barely cut through the mist, the road ahead now barely visible, swallowed by a dense white void. The world outside the car felt like it was dissolving into nothingness. The voice came again, and this time it was closer, right next to his ear, a whisper of cold breath against his skin. "You can't run from me. You can't escape your past." Ethan's chest tightened. He remembered that voice, deep inside of him, somewhere hidden beneath the fear. But it wasn't the voice of the man sitting behind him. No, it was the voice of something older, something far more ancient. His mind struggled to connect the dots, his memories swirling in confusion. The fog pressed harder against the windows, the temperature inside the car plummeting to an impossible low. His fingers were numb now, frozen to the wheel, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the presence, the feeling that something was watching him from all directions. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, like a weight pushing him down, sinking him into the depths of an abyss. Another flash of movement in the rearview mirror. The man's face, twisted, distorted, seemed to flicker, as though he was something caught between worlds, not quite of this reality. His eyes bored into Ethan's, full of something that wasn't just malice. No, there was something deeper, darker, something that felt far too familiar. "I'm not who you think I am," the man said, his voice now echoing in Ethan's mind, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. "I'm just a reflection, a mirror to your guilt." Ethan's breath quickened. Guilt. The word hit him like a blow to the gut. Guilt. The weight of it surged through him, pushing into his chest, making it harder to breathe. His grip on the wheel tightened even more, the cold creeping up his arms, freezing him to the bone. His mind raced. What had he done? What was the man talking about? He couldn't remember, couldn't bring the details into focus, only flashes, fragments, a mistake, a regret, something buried deep within him, something he had locked away, never allowed himself to confront. You remember now, don't you? The man's voice was mocking now, a laugh bubbling up, though it was not the man in the back seat who laughed. It was the fog itself. The very air seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy, like it was alive. "Tell me," the man crooned, his voice twisting, "what's it like to drown in your own past?" The car jolted suddenly, snapping Ethan from his spiraling thoughts. The road had disappeared, replaced by something far darker, far more distorted. The fog no longer pressed at the windows. It was inside the car now, swirling around Ethan like a living entity. The air was thick with the smell of rot, of decay. His heart raced, pounding so violently in his chest that it almost drowned out the voices. The man in the back seat moved. Ethan didn't see it, but he felt it, his presence shifting, filling the car like smoke. It was as though the man was stretching, becoming something more, something that defied the laws of reality. Ethan whipped his head around to the back seat, his pulse racing, but the man was gone again. There was nothing in the back seat, nothing but the suffocating fog. "Where are you?" Ethan's voice cracked, his panic rising. He slammed his foot onto the brake, his mind a blur of confusion and terror. The car skidded to a halt, the tires screeching against the wet road, but it didn't stop. The car kept moving, sliding forward as if something else was pushing it forward. "Stop!" Ethan screamed, his voice raw, but the car ignored him, sliding further into the dark fog. He reached for the door handle, his hands trembling, but it wouldn't open. He pulled harder, but the door was stuck. Something was holding it shut. The world around him spun, the fog closing in so tight now that it felt like they were trapped in some kind of twisted dream, a nightmare where the rules of reality no longer applied. The man's voice echoed from all directions. "You never should have come here, Ethan." Ethan's breath came in quick, sharp gasps, and for a moment, he almost gave in to the overwhelming terror. He nearly screamed, but then, crack. A loud, sharp noise filled the car, something breaking, something shifting. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he jerked his head toward the rearview mirror again. And there, in the reflection, stood the man. Not a shadow, not a whisper. He was solid now, fully formed. His features were unmistakable, his face an amalgamation of something ancient and twisted, eyes hollow, but burning with an impossible intensity. And then the man smiled, a smile that chilled Ethan to his very core. "Are you ready to face it?" the man whispered, his voice slow, deliberate, like an executioner preparing to strike the final blow. Ethan's world tilted as his mind spiraled into a spiral of panic, guilt, and confusion, his body frozen in place. He wanted to scream, wanted to do anything to stop this, to escape. But all he could do was watch as the figure in the mirror seemed to step forward. And with that, the fog around them shifted. Something deep, something ancient, something hungry shifted with it. The car. Ethan and the man, all of them, trapped in this place where the rules of life no longer applied. And just like that, everything went dark. Darkness. It was the only thing Ethan could feel now. The kind of darkness that pressed against his eyelids, that swirled in his chest, that consumed him. The fog inside the car had thickened so completely that it was as if he had been plunged into some other world, a void where time and space no longer existed. The air tasted like rot and decay, suffocating every breath he took, and the bitter cold seeped into his very bones. Ethan opened his eyes, or at least he thought he did. The world around him was still black, an unyielding, oppressive void that stretched infinitely in every direction. His hands trembled, but they didn't seem to belong to him anymore. His fingers felt stiff and cold, as if they were encased in ice. He couldn't remember when the fog had overtaken the car, or how he had ended up in this strange limbo, but all he could feel was that unrelenting cold and the weight of the silence that pressed in on him from every side. He couldn't move. It was as if the very air had turned to stone, solidifying around him, trapping him in place. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the void, his heart hammered in his chest, his breath ragged as panic rose like a tide, but his body refused to respond. It was as if he had been frozen, paralyzed, helpless. And then he felt the presence. It began as a whisper in the back of his mind, just a flutter of movement, a feeling more than a sound. He couldn't explain it, but it was unmistakable. The feeling of being watched, the sensation of someone or something looming just behind him, its presence suffocating, heavy, malevolent. His skin crawled, every nerve on edge, as though something was reaching out to touch him, something far darker than anything he had ever encountered. His heart skipped a beat, then another. The air grew colder still, and a voice, low and jagged, sliced through the stillness. "Do you remember?" The voice was the same as before, the man in the back seat, the one who had twisted his mind into knots with words he didn't understand, with questions that had no answers. It was the same, but somehow it had changed, deepened, become something more sinister, something older. "Do you remember what you did?" The voice whispered again, slithering into his thoughts, tightening its grip. Ethan's mind screamed. He couldn't remember. His memories were like fractured glass, each piece jagged, broken. He tried to pull them together, to make sense of it. But each attempt was met with the overwhelming sensation of something slipping just out of reach. His memories were there, locked away. But the harder he tried to grasp them, the further they seemed to fade. "Let me go," Ethan gasped, his voice barely a whisper in the suffocating darkness. The fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, swirling around him like a living entity, twisting and writhing in the confined space of the car. It pressed against him, cold and smothering, until it felt as though the very air was suffocating him. "No," the voice responded, almost amused. "You can't escape. Not from me. Not from yourself." The fog parted for a brief moment, just a sliver of light, a tiny crack in the overwhelming darkness. And there, in the distant haze, Ethan saw it. The faint silhouette of a building, barely visible through the fog, standing at the edge of a forgotten road. The destination. The place he had been driving toward. His hands began to shake harder, the feeling of dread rising like bile in his throat. How had he ended up here? How had he driven this far into the unknown? The fog had swallowed the road, the world, his sense of reality. The building. No, it wasn't a building. It was a house. An old, dilapidated house, one that seemed to have existed outside of time. Its structure was twisted, the windows broken, the wood rotting, giving the entire thing a feeling of decay, of abandonment, of death. A place where things were forgotten, where memories went to die. And yet, there it stood, waiting for him. This place, Ethan thought. I've seen it before. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The house. It wasn't unfamiliar. He had been here before, in his past, in a life he had long since buried. He had left this place, left these memories behind, but now they were crawling back up, clawing their way into his mind. He remembered it now, his family, the accident. A flash of pain, sharp, vivid, cut through his mind, and he gasped, his body lurching forward as if to escape the memory. But it was already there. The accident had taken everything from him, his parents, his sister, his life, shattered in an instant. Ethan had driven that night. He had been the one behind the wheel, and it had been his fault. His fault. The weight of that truth hit him like a freight train, crushing him under its weight. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to remember it, to face it, but now it was all flooding back, the crash, the blood, the silence, the guilt. "You remember now," the voice whispered, almost tender. "You've always known what you did." Ethan's hands shook violently as the car seemed to lurch forward on its own, moving toward the house. He tried to stop it, but the brake pedal wouldn't respond. His foot was stuck in place, the car pushing forward against his will. The fog thickened around him again, closing in on the vehicle, suffocating him in its suffocating grip. His pulse raced as the car came to a stop, the headlights illuminating the decaying house before him. It was as if the car had come to a standstill on its own, pulled by an unseen force, a force tied to the house. The door to the house creaked open slowly, impossibly slow, as though something or someone had been waiting for him. The voice in his mind grew louder, more insistent. "You must face it now, Ethan. You can't run anymore. The house, it is yours. It always has been. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat was tight, the air too thick to breathe. He tried to move, tried to get out of the car, but his body was frozen in place, held captive by the presence that had followed him from the depths of his past. A figure appeared in the doorway of the house, standing there in the shadows. It was a woman. No, it wasn't just a woman. It was her, his sister, the one he had lost in the crash. She stood in the doorway, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes hollow and empty, her lips parted. And for a moment Ethan thought she might speak, but no sound came from her mouth. Instead, the door creaked wider, and the fog seemed to swallow the entire scene, pulling him in deeper, closer to the memory he had locked away. It wasn't over. It had never been over. And just as the fog closed in around him, his sister's voice finally broke through, distorted and distant, as if it was coming from the very walls of the car itself. "Come inside, Ethan," she whispered. "You can never leave." The air inside the car had grown suffocating, thick, with an unnatural chill that made Ethan's every breath feel like he was inhaling shards of ice. His body trembled, yet he could barely feel it. The fog around him was no longer just a weather phenomenon. It was alive, pulsating, feeding on his fear, on his guilt. It crept into every corner of his mind, every crevice of his soul. The house before him, his childhood home, the place he had long tried to forget, stood in silence, the broken windows like hollow eyes staring out into the empty road. A gust of wind stirred the fog, sending it swirling like a dark vortex, and for a brief moment Ethan thought he saw something in the doorway. A figure. No. Her. His sister. Her face was pale, a ghostly image etched in his memory, her eyes empty and dark, as though she were the very embodiment of the tragedy that had destroyed their lives. Ethan's stomach twisted painfully as his mind reeled. He had tried to bury this part of his past, to escape it, but the house had drawn him back, dragged him to confront what he had done, what he had caused. The guilt pressed in on him like a vice, suffocating him, drowning him. "Come inside, Ethan." Her voice echoed in his mind, soft and pleading, yet empty of emotion. "You can never leave." Ethan shook his head, trying to clear it, trying to push the memory away. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart racing as if it were trying to escape his chest. He gripped the steering wheel harder, but the car refused to move. It was as if the house, the fog, the very air itself had a hold on him, a force far stronger than his will. "Please, no," Ethan whispered to himself, trying to rally the strength to act, to do anything that could break the cycle. But the fog pressed closer, filling the car, making it impossible to breathe, impossible to think. He had to leave. He had to get away, but his foot remained frozen on the brake. No matter how much he tried to push it, the pedal wouldn't budge. The car was no longer his to control. A muffled creak echoed from the house. The door had swung wide open, revealing the dark, decaying interior. The once familiar hallway now seemed alien, like a place out of time, a place where the dead and the living converged in a sickening dance. The wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards warped and broken, but it was the smell that hit him hardest, the stench of decay, of rot, of a place long abandoned, except by the ghosts of the past. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as the figure in the doorway stepped forward. It was her, his sister, but she wasn't the young, vibrant girl he remembered. No, this was something else, something twisted, her form flickering between that of a young girl and a ghastly, broken thing. Her body seemed to shimmer, distort, as if she wasn't entirely there, her edges bleeding into the fog. She tilted her head, her eyes empty and dark, gazing into Ethan's soul as if she were reading the deepest parts of him. the parts he had, hidden for so long. "You've never forgiven yourself, have you?" Her voice was quiet, but it rang in his ears like the toll of a bell, deep and resonant, echoing through his entire being. Ethan recoiled, his stomach lurching. He wanted to look away, to shut his eyes, to block out the image of her. But he couldn't. The fog, the house, the memory, it held him captive. He was trapped, both in the car and in his own mind, where his guilt had festered for so long. The house was not just a house. It was a prison built from the memories he had tried to bury, the sins he had never atoned for, the accident, the crash. His sister's lifeless body, lying cold and broken beside him. "You can't run." Her voice echoed again, her eyes hollow as the darkened fog crept closer. "You can't hide from what you've done." Ethan's hands were shaking now, the sensation of coldness seeping through the marrow of his bones. The truth was inescapable. The weight of it, the burden he had carried all these years, had finally come crashing down. It was never about the house. It was never about the fog. It was about him, his actions, his failure. The fog around him seemed to pulse, like a living thing, responding to his fear, to his guilt. The air became thick and oppressive, and his chest felt as though it was being crushed under the weight of it all. He tried to breathe, but the air felt stagnant, suffocating. His pulse quickened as he thought he might choke on the very atmosphere surrounding him. "Please," Ethan whispered, his voice a broken plea. He wasn't sure who he was asking. Who was he pleading to? His sister? The fog? Himself? He had never stopped running from his guilt, from his past, but now there was nowhere to run. "Please, I'm sorry." The fog began to churn more, violently now, wrapping around the car in tight coils, pulling in the very air. Ethan's heart hammered as the temperature inside the car dropped sharply, a blast of cold so intense it burned his skin. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows in the cabin, and the house in front of him began to warp. The walls seemed to move, stretching and twisting, like the very foundation of reality was breaking apart. "Do you hear it?" the voice of his sister asked, her tone no longer pleading but cold, like the wind in winter. "The sound of your own death?" Ethan looked into the rearview mirror again, desperately searching for something, anything familiar. But the reflection wasn't his own. Instead, it was a twisted, decayed version of him. Pale, hollow-eyed, skin stretched tight over his bones. His reflection grinned back at him, an expression of pure, unrelenting dread. A flash of memory struck him, sudden and brutal. The crash, the twisted metal, the blood. The scream that never ended. Ethan's stomach twisted, the suffocating realization crashing over him again, drowning him in his own failure. His sister had been in the car with him. They had been driving home together, just the two of them, when it happened. He had been drunk. He had made the decision to drive, and it had cost her life. The fog thickened, pulling him deeper into the grip of his guilt, of the truth he could no longer escape. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered again, his voice cracked, strained, as if the weight of the apology alone could break him apart. The figure in the doorway, his sister, smiled. But it was a smile full of malice, full of the same emptiness he had seen in her eyes from the very beginning. She wasn't real. None of this was. It was all a reflection, a manifestation of everything he had run from. And then, the voice whispered, "One last time, cold and final, you'll never escape me. You'll never escape yourself." The car began to move again, this time without Ethan's control. It lurched forward, and the fog closed in around him, the house slowly receding into the distance, fading into nothingness. The car moved through a tunnel of mist, the world outside becoming an indistinct blur until there was only the relentless darkness. The car sped forward, its tires slicing through the fog, the engine roaring against the oppressive silence. Ethan couldn't remember how long he had been driving. Hours, minutes. Time no longer made sense. It was all a blur, a distorted stretch of black and white that looped and spiraled in his mind until he wasn't sure where reality ended and the nightmare began. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, his breath shallow and ragged. The fog outside had closed in around him again, thick and suffocating, its presence pressing against the windows like a wall. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a void of uncertainty, but the worst part wasn't the fog or the house or the haunting memories. It was the voice that still lingered in his mind, echoing with the same chilling message over and over. You'll never escape. The words were not just spoken, they were felt, digging into his mind like splinters of ice. Every part of him ached, as if the guilt, the fear, had become a physical weight that pressed him into the seat. The fog around him seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, feeding on his desperation. Ethan's heart raced. He couldn't outrun this. No matter how fast he drove, how far he went, the past would always catch up to him. The truth would always find him, clawing its way to the surface, dragging him back to the moment he had tried so desperately to forget. The crash, his fault. The car's headlights flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows on the road ahead. For a split second, Ethan thought he saw something in the rearview mirror. Another figure. No, the figure. The man from the back seat. The one who had been haunting him throughout this twisted journey. But when he glanced quickly at the mirror, the back seat was empty. The man wasn't there. Neither was his sister. For a moment, Ethan thought he might be imagining it all. Perhaps the fog had driven him mad, or the weight of the guilt had pushed him to the brink. His vision swam. His mind was a tangled mess of memories, fears, and regrets. But there was no denying the truth. He had done something terrible, something unforgivable. The road ahead didn't bend, it didn't curve. It stretched out, straight and unending, disappearing into the fog. There was no end to it, just like there was no end to his remorse. And then the car jerked, the tires screeching as the vehicle suddenly swerved to the side, a violent force pulling it off the road. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the world around him tilted, the fog pressing in so tightly it seemed to suffocate him. His eyes widened as the headlights cut through the darkness, revealing an ancient crumbling stone wall just ahead. It was an old road barrier, one that shouldn't have been there, one that had never been there before. The car's tires hit the gravel, and Ethan slammed his foot on the brake, but the car didn't stop. It lurched forward, scraping against the stone wall as he fought. To regain control, panic coursing through his veins. "Not again," he shouted, his voice raw, desperate. The car finally screeched to a halt, but Ethan was no longer in control. His hands were shaking violently, his body cold with fear. For the first time, he didn't know where he was anymore. This place, this road, was no longer familiar. It was a forgotten path, a dead end. But it wasn't the road that made him stop. It was the voice that echoed in his mind, now louder than ever. "You're here," the voice whispered, its words sinking deep into his skin. "You've always been here." Ethan turned, eyes wide, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he looked directly into the rearview mirror. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was him, but not him. The figure in the back seat was him, but twisted, broken. His eyes were dark pools of emptiness, his skin pale, almost translucent, as if he were nothing but a shadow, a memory made flesh. The face staring back at him was no longer human. It was a distorted version of himself, a mirror of all the guilt and the terror he had tried to escape. The man, Ethan's reflection, grinned back at him, the expression devoid of humanity. "Welcome home, Ethan." The words sliced through him like a blade, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, Ethan understood. The truth. The final, crushing truth. The fog, the house, his sister, the man in the rearview mirror. They had all been him. He had never been driving to pick up a passenger. There had never been anyone in the back seat. There had never been a destination. The car had been his prison, his escape, his torment. All of it. The haunting voice, the ghostly presence of his sister, the man who had mirrored his every move. It was all a reflection of his own guilt, his own fear, his own inability to face the truth. Ethan had never been driving. He had never left the crash site. The fog wasn't just outside. It was inside him. The man in the back seat wasn't a ghost, but a part of himself he had tried to bury, a part of himself that had been haunting him for years, ever since that fateful night when he had killed his sister. He had been running from the accident, running from the truth, running from his own reflection. But the truth had always been here, waiting for him. As the reality of his situation settled in, Ethan's breath hitched. The car, the fog, the twisted reflections. They had all been an extension of his mind, a culmination of his guilt and his punishment. He was trapped in a cycle he could never escape. He finally turned his eyes away from the mirror, his chest heavy with the weight of his realization. The road was still before him, the fog still pressing in on him, but now it was not the world that was closing in. It was himself. The door was still closed, but Ethan didn't need to open it. He was already home. The car jolted forward again, and then nothing. The car shuddered as it began to move again. But it wasn't Ethan driving it. It wasn't even a car anymore. It was something much worse, a vessel for the very essence of his guilt, a cage that had been his home all along. His breath caught as the world outside continued to twist, the fog pressing against the windows like an insidious force, thickening and swirling with every passing second. His body felt heavy, like he was sinking into the seat, trapped in the very fabric of the nightmare he had created. His fingers, stiff and trembling, were still gripped around the steering wheel, but it was no longer necessary. The car didn't need him to drive it. It was moving on its own, steering itself into the heart of the endless fog, pulling him deeper into the darkness that had been following him for so long. The reflection in the rearview mirror remained. Ethan had tried to look away from it, but he couldn't. It wasn't just his reflection. It was him, and not him at the same time. The figure in the mirror was pale and gaunt, the skin stretched thin over bones that seemed to ache with the weight of 1,000 regrets. His eyes, dark and empty, were pools of guilt that stared back at him with an intensity that cut straight through his soul. His reflection grinned, an unsettling smile that didn't belong to him, a smile that wasn't his. "You can't escape," the reflection whispered, its voice coming not from the back seat, but from within his mind. The words were laced with venom, with years of torment, and they dug into his consciousness like nails on glass. "I've always been here, Ethan. You've never left." "Not really." Ethan's chest tightened, and his breathing became shallow. The suffocating weight of his own guilt pressed against him, drowning him. Every word, every whisper from his reflection felt like a hammer against his skull, breaking through the fragile barriers he had built to keep the truth at bay. "You're not real," Ethan whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking under the strain. His heart was racing now, each beat a loud, painful thump in his ears. He turned his gaze from the mirror for a moment, but when he looked back, the figure remained. "I am as real as you," the reflection replied, its voice echoing in the confines of his mind, growing louder with each passing second. "You've been running from me, Ethan, but you can't outrun yourself." His pulse pounded in his ears. He tried to look away, to escape it, but the reflection was no longer just a mirror. It was him, inescapably tied to him. The more he resisted, the more it consumed him. His reflection seemed to stretch, to expand beyond the confines of the glass, its presence filling the entire car. The fog outside began to swirl violently, creeping in through the cracks in the windows, its cold fingers sliding through the air. Ethan's skin crawled, his senses overwhelmed by the cold, the sound, the voice, the undeniable truth. "You've always known," the reflection continued, its smile widening as if it were relishing in the moment of revelation. "You killed her. You killed your sister. You couldn't even save her. You couldn't even stop it." Ethan recoiled, but the reflection only grew stronger, more defined. It no longer looked like just a twisted image. It looked real, as though the nightmare had somehow bled into his waking world. The fog continued to thicken, suffocating him with its cold embrace. It was the air itself, the world outside, the reflection in the mirror. It was all him, all a part of his guilt. He was trapped in this endless cycle of remorse, his mind unable to escape from the prison he had built with his own hands. "Stop!" Ethan screamed, his voice breaking. But the words only made the reflection grin wider. The car seemed to lurch forward again, but this time the road had vanished. There was no path ahead, no end in sight. The headlights cut through the thick fog, illuminating nothing but an endless white void. There was no beginning, no end, only the reflection, stretching endlessly before him, distorting his very sense of reality. The voice in his mind grew louder, more insistent. "You can never escape, Ethan. You've never left. You'll never be free." And then the figure in the rearview mirror moved, not with the jerky, distorted motions of a reflection, but with a fluid, purposeful motion. It moved, closer, reaching out with long, bony fingers, its face now inches from Ethan's own. Its grin stretched wider, its eyes darker, colder. The car seemed to shudder in response, the fog swirling violently around the vehicle. Ethan could feel it now, the presence of something darker, something older, something that had always been inside him, that had always waited for this moment. His guilt, his failure, his reflection was not just a mirror, not just a shadow. It was the physical manifestation of everything he had tried to run from, everything he had refused to confront. It had always been here. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone in the car. He never had been. The reflection raised its hand, and Ethan's body froze. A coldness washed over him, a deep, suffocating cold that gnawed at his bones. His reflection's smile grew wider, impossibly wide, and its eyes gleamed with a terrible, knowing light. "Face it," the reflection whispered. "It's all your fault. You killed her." The car lurched forward again, but this time Ethan wasn't controlling it. The fog outside began to close in, blurring everything in sight. There was nothing but the endless stretch of darkness and the overwhelming weight of his own guilt. The reflection in the mirror, his own face, had taken on a life of its own, twisting and warping, grinning at him with malevolent joy. The car seemed to speed up, hurtling into the fog with no end in sight. Ethan's hands were still frozen to the wheel, but his body had become a part of the car now, bound to the vehicle, bound to the nightmare. The reflection in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was him. He was trapped in his own self-loathing, unable to escape. The fog thickened, the air growing colder still. His heart pounded, the sound echoing in his ears as the road ahead stretched on, an endless, twisting path of no return. The reflection in the mirror grinned wider, its eyes now completely black, an abyss that seemed to pull him in, pulling him into the very center of the fog, into the center of his own mind. And then, just as he thought he might drown in the weight of it all, just as he thought he would lose himself forever, he realized something. The reflection wasn't just there to torment him, it was a part of him. It had always been a part of him. The reflection had no power over him, it only existed because he allowed it to. He could stop this. Ethan's mind screamed with the realization, and with that scream, the grip on his soul loosened. The fog began to thin, the weight on his chest lightened, the reflection's grip on him loosening, weakening. The road ahead was still there, a distant, impossible thing. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan understood. He couldn't outrun his past, but he could face it. He could look into the mirror and see what he had done, what he had become, and accept it. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally break free. The car jolted to a stop. The fog around him parted. The road ahead was clear, and as the fog began to fade, so too did the reflection in the rearview mirror. The smile that had once haunted him began to fade, leaving only the cold, empty silence of the car. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of the truth settle inside him, and with it, the cold embrace of freedom. Ethan sat in silence. The car had come to a complete stop, engine idling with a low hum that felt almost foreign now, like something from another life. His hands trembled on the wheel, his breath slow, uneven. The rearview mirror no longer held. The twisted reflection, the malicious grin, the accusing eyes. It was just a mirror now, showing nothing but the dimly lit back seat, empty and still. The fog had begun to lift, but it didn't vanish. It receded, as if slinking back into the cracks of the world, waiting for another moment, another soul. A soft, cold wind passed through the car, even though the windows were shut, brushing Ethan's cheek like the breath of something long gone. Outside, the road stretched forward, an old, forgotten path now visible in the pre-dawn light. Trees lined either side, skeletal and silent. There was no sign of the twisted house, no looming figure in the doorway. Only the distant call of a crow and the soft whisper of leaves rustling on the roadside, like the world itself exhaling. Ethan reached up slowly, touched the mirror, half expecting the pale version of himself to snap back into view. But it didn't. His own face looked back now, aged by more than years, hollowed by what he had faced. There were still dark rings beneath his eyes, still lines etched by grief. But it was him, truly him. And in that simple reflection, there was something else. Recognition. He whispered, "I remember." And in remembering, the fog within him began to clear. His sister's voice no longer echoed in his ears, no longer twisted by sorrow or malice. Instead, he remembered her laughter, bright, full of life. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his when they were children. He remembered the way she forgave so easily, the way she had trusted him. He had taken that trust and shattered it. That truth remained etched deep into him. The past would never change. He had driven that car drunk. He had lost control. He had survived. She hadn't. But he understood something now. Atonement isn't forgetting. It's remembering with your eyes open. Ethan turned off the engine. He sat there for a long moment, the silence around him no longer hostile, but weighty in a different way, like the hush that follows a storm. Something within him had shifted. He could feel the raw wound of guilt still there, but no longer festering in the dark. It had been brought into the light, and though it hurt, though it left him raw and exposed, it was real. He opened the door. The fog outside kissed his skin but did not swallow him this time. It no longer tried to creep into his lungs. It simply drifted around him, indifferent. He stepped out, his feet crunching softly on gravel. The road ahead led somewhere now. not back, not forward in the usual sense either. It wasn't a destination on a map. It was a direction, a path of his choosing. Behind him, the car sat quiet, the mirror no longer a gate to something else. Just glass, just memory, just reflection. But as Ethan began to walk, feet slow and steady toward that grey horizon, he felt a final shiver down his spine. Not cold, not fear, presence. He turned back slowly. The back seat was empty, the mirror unbroken. But in the far, far distance, almost too far to see, a figure stood in the fog, tall, motionless, watching. The man from the rear view. Ethan didn't move. He simply watched. The figure made no gesture, spoke no word. They both stood there, man and shadow. And then the fog curled around the figure and swallowed him whole. Gone, leaving Ethan alone. He turned away, took a step forward, then another, and another. Behind him, the car sat like a tombstone on a road that did not exist. A monument to a memory. A place where past and present had collided, and something unspeakable had shown him the truth. The fog might come back. The reflection might return. He didn't know, but now at least he would recognize it, and he would not look away. And so, the road remembers. The mirror waits, and the fog never forgets. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The campus library stood at the edge of the university, a monolithic building of red brick and aged glass that seemed to stretch upwards, darker than the night itself. A quiet sentinel amid the sprawling college grounds. Tonight, though, it felt more like a tomb, its long, narrow halls filled with the quiet rustling of paper and the distant hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It was 3 a.m. Elliot stared at the clock, his gaze flicking from the hands to the nearly empty shelves around him. The library was vast, too vast to be this empty at this hour, yet no one else had signed up for the overnight shift but him. The deep silence pressed in from all sides. He shifted in his chair, adjusted his glasses, and tried to push away the discomfort that gnawed at him. His job was simple: check in with the students studying late into the night, make sure the machines were running, and keep the space in order. Not much to do at this hour, especially since most students had cleared out hours ago. The sounds of the world beyond the library's heavy walls felt so distant, muffled by the thick walls and worn carpet. The only other noise was the soft hum of the air conditioning system, cooling the large building and keeping the staleness at bay. But tonight, there was something else. Elliot had first thought it was his imagination. At first, he had merely heard the faintest of whispers. He thought he might have been hearing things, the product of too much coffee and a lack of sleep. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the whispers grew, low and barely perceptible, yet undeniable. They came from somewhere beyond the stacks, somewhere deep within the labyrinth of bookshelves. They tickled the edges of his hearing, fleeting and disjointed, like voices carried on the wind. He froze, his fingers hovering above the keyboard of his laptop. The clicking of the keys had become a constant, the noise now drowned out by something he couldn't quite place. Was someone in the library? He blinked, listening hard. The whispers were louder now, drawing closer. "Hello," Elliot called, trying to mask the unease in his voice. His words seemed to hang in the air, swallowed by the heavy quiet. No answer. The whispering continued. His first instinct was to brush it off. After all, the place was old, and in places like this, the building itself had a way of making sounds, creaks, groans, wind rustling through the cracks of the aging windows. But something about this felt different. This wasn't the sound of the building settling. No. These whispers were intentional, as if someone or something was trying to get his attention. Elliot stood up slowly, his shoes making a soft scuffing noise as he stepped away from his desk. The quiet around him felt almost oppressive, as if the library was holding its breath. He walked toward the sound, toward the far corner where the whispers seemed to come from, the aisles of towering bookshelves stretching out in all directions. The building was arranged in a maze-like structure with rows upon rows of books that spiraled upward, hidden from view unless you stepped closer to the aisles. The whispers led him to one such aisle, the one that always felt slightly off when he worked late. The bookshelves in this section were older, worn down by years of use. The scent of musty paper hung thick in the air. He couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease as he looked down the row. It was too quiet, too still. Something had shifted. The books. They were not as they had been before. The shelves, which he had only checked half an hour earlier, seemed disturbed, as if someone had been rifling through them. Books were out of order, scattered in a disarray that made no sense, as if someone had been pulling them out and putting them back, but in the wrong places. The floor was littered with a few stray volumes, none of them falling naturally from the shelves. They had been placed there, carefully discarded as though someone had dropped them mid-research. Elliot's heart began to pound in his chest, the quiet whispering still hanging in the air, now strangely accompanied by the sound of a soft shuffling. The hairs on his neck stood on end. He didn't know why, but the longer he stood there, the more he felt a growing sense of dread. His footsteps seemed louder now, echoing through the cavernous space, amplified by the strange stillness that surrounded him. The sound of the whispers died abruptly, leaving an eerie void in their wake. But something else now lingered, a sense of wrongness, a quiet void that seemed to pulse just out of his line of sight. He turned his head, scanning the aisles, but saw nothing. He glanced down at the books again. The open pages of one book caught his attention, a dark, heavy tome whose cover was unfamiliar. It had been placed open on the floor, as if someone had carelessly left it behind. He reached down to pick it up, his fingers brushing the edge of the worn pages. The book felt strange in his hands, its leather cover oddly cold, and the air around it felt heavier. As he opened the pages, he found nothing but ancient, handwritten notes, frantic scribbles in a language he couldn't recognize. His stomach churned, and he quickly closed the book. It felt wrong. A loud beep echoed from the security desk. The sudden sound startled him, and he jumped, instinctively pulling the book closer to his chest. His eyes darted toward the security monitor, the screens flickering slightly as if something was disturbing the signal. The library's camera feed was displayed, showing each aisle with the clear, grainy imagery of a late-night camera. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then he saw it. In the grainy image on the leftmost monitor, a shadow moved, a figure, dark and indistinct, slowly gliding from one aisle to another. The figure's movements were fluid and unnatural, as if it was floating just above the ground. Its form indistinct, constantly shifting in and out of view. It passed between the rows of books, vanishing and reappearing, never quite settling. Elliot's heart skipped a beat, his breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen, transfixed, unable to move as the shadow lingered, flickering at the edges of the camera's frame, just beyond clear sight. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. His pulse hammered in his chest, his palms clammy as his mind raced. What had he just seen? His thoughts were a whirlwind, struggling to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a glitch in the cameras, a distortion in the feed. But the dread he felt in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. He sprang from the desk, bolting toward the aisle on the monitor where the shadow had been. His shoes slapped against the worn carpet as he moved quickly, a sick feeling crawling up his spine. He wasn't sure what he was going to find, but something told him he needed to act fast. The air in the aisle felt colder as he reached the section. Empty, just books, books that seemed untouched, undisturbed. He spun in place, scanning every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. The aisle stretched out before him, stretching further into the unknown. Nothing. His hands trembled slightly, his body tense, every muscle screaming to leave. But he couldn't. He had to understand what was happening. He turned to head back toward the security desk, his mind racing with every step. Something was wrong here. Something was so wrong. Before he could reach the desk, he heard it. A whisper. Close. Too close. Help me. The voice was soft, breathy, almost imperceptible, but it pierced through the oppressive silence like a needle. Elliot froze. The voice sounded familiar, and then, with an eerie clarity, it hit him. The voice was the same as the one in the whispers, the same voice that had been pulling him in. The whisper hung in the air like smoke, curling around Elliot's senses. Help me. The words wrapped themselves around his mind, making his heart skip, then pound, each beat feeling heavier than the last. He spun around, the sound of his own, breath seeming too loud in the silence, the hairs on his neck standing on end. It came from the aisle behind him. A chill swept through him, settling in his bones, deeper than any cold the library's old ventilation system could manage. His mouth went dry as his eyes scanned the row of bookshelves in front of him, the narrow, dimly lit corridor filled with the shadows of endless volumes. The faint hum of the overhead lights did nothing to calm his nerves. Instead, they made everything feel more unnatural, as though the light itself was struggling to keep the dark at bay. "Who's there?" Elliot called, his voice shaking slightly, betraying his attempt to remain calm. His throat tightened, as if the library itself was holding its breath. He stood still, waiting for a response, but the only answer was the soft rustling sound of pages turning, faint but unmistakable, as though something unseen was sifting through books, pulling them off the shelves with an unsettling precision. His feet moved of their own accord, taking one hesitant step after another, deeper into the aisle. The air grew heavier with each footfall, thick with the smell of aged paper and dust. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing on his chest, making it harder to breathe. His pulse was a drumbeat in his ears, drowning out everything except the overwhelming sense that he wasn't alone. A faint shadow shifted at the corner of his vision. Elliot froze. He knew he had seen it, but when he turned his head sharply, the shadow was gone. His gaze darted to the far end of the aisle. No movement. The books remained as still and silent as ever. But then, something new. A soft scraping sound, a faint dragging noise like a book being pulled across the floor, followed by a slight rustle of paper. Elliot's stomach churned, the dread inside, him growing heavier, thicker, like something was coiling around his heart. This wasn't just a sound, it was intentional. A presence was here, moving in ways that were deliberate and unnerving. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of a nearby bookshelf. The wood felt cold, slick, with the moisture of age and decay. A sharp, sudden shiver ran through him as his hand grazed a spine of a book that didn't belong. It was old, too old. The leather cover was cracked, the title illegible, its edges worn to the point of fraying. The moment his fingers touched it, the whisper returned. "Help me." The voice was clearer now, more distinct, a childlike whimper laced with an unmistakable sense of despair. His body tensed, the cold creeping deeper into his skin. The sensation of being watched grew overwhelming, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention, as if some unseen pair of eyes were boring into his every movement. He couldn't help it. He opened the book. The moment the cover flipped open, a sharp gust of air blew through the aisle, swirling dust and debris into the dim light. The pages inside were filled with strange, handwritten notes in a language that made no sense, twisted and looping into bizarre patterns. As he flicked through the pages, the whispering intensified, growing louder with each turn. He felt a pull, an undeniable force drawing him further into the book's depths, as if the pages themselves were calling to him. And then, in the very last pages, he found it. A name. Lena Hawthorne, his breath caught. He knew that name. Lena Hawthorne had gone. Missing 5 years ago, it had been a story that had chilled the campus. A tale that had left students whispering in hallways long after the news had faded from the papers. She had been a student here, just like him. Bright, curious, always lost in a book. It was said she had vanished late one night in the library, leaving behind nothing but an overturned chair and an empty bag. But the strangest part of her disappearance had always been the strange note she had left behind. It had been found at her last known location, a cryptic message that no one could decipher. And now, this book, the one that had been left open in this aisle of all places, contained her name. It was her handwriting. Elliot's fingers trembled. As he set the book down, his heart pounding. What was happening? Was this a coincidence? The more he thought about it, the more the threads of the story began to pull at him, unraveling his sense of reality. A shadow moved again, this time more distinct, more solid. It was a shape, tall and thin, flickering between the bookshelves, its form uncertain but its presence undeniable. Elliot's throat tightened and he took a step back, heart racing. The figure moved toward him, slow, deliberate and silent. He couldn't move, his feet frozen to the ground, his breath shallow and erratic. "Who are you?" he whispered, but his voice was barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. The figure stopped. It hovered just at the edge of his vision, a formless silhouette, but something in its presence made the air feel dense, suffocating. Then the whisper came again, louder now, resonating in his chest like a drumbeat. "Help me." Elliot's mind whirled, the pieces of the puzzle coming together in fragments. The whispers, the books, Lena Hawthorne. It was all connected, somehow, impossibly, all of it tied together in this cursed library. He couldn't stay here any longer. His feet finally obeyed, and he sprinted toward the security desk, the shadows shifting at his heels. His breath was coming in ragged gasps, his pulse pounding in his ears. The shadows seemed to follow, always just out of reach, but he couldn't look back. He didn't dare. He slammed his hand onto the security panel, the blinking lights on the screen confirming what he feared. There was no sign of anyone else in the building, no other figures on the cameras, no one else but him. The library was still empty. And yet, the feeling of being watched persisted, creeping up from behind him like a cold hand on his shoulder. With trembling fingers, Elliot pulled up the footage from the past few hours. The timeline was normal at first, his own movements around the library flashing on the screen. But then, the figure appeared again, flashing across the frame like a dark blur. It seemed to move through the aisles, skirting the edges of the cameras. Always in the periphery, never fully captured, it moved between rows where there should have been no one. The figure didn't follow the path a person would take. It floated, slid, like something not entirely bound to the physical world. Elliot felt his stomach turn as he watched the figure approach the very aisle where he had just been. His hands gripped the desk, his knuckles white. The shadow on the screen seemed to pause for a moment, just as the camera shifted, and for the briefest of moments, it almost looked like the figure had stopped directly in front of the camera lens, staring back at him. His breath caught in his throat as the shadow faded from view. But he wasn't alone anymore. A noise, faint but unmistakable, came from behind him. A soft rustling, like the turning of pages. No, not pages. It was the sound of something else. Something that didn't belong in the library. Something alive. Elliot turned, and there it was. The figure. It stood at the end of the aisle, its face now clear, its form slowly solidifying, taking shape before his eyes. The shadow was no longer just a silhouette. It was Lena. Her features were distorted, her eyes dark voids, her skin pale and stretched, her expression vacant, like someone who had been lost in time itself. Her lips parted, and she spoke again. "Help me." And this time, Elliot knew. He had seen the truth, understood the horrifying reality. The library had never let her go. It was not just the building that was haunted. It was something deeper, something ancient, pulling everyone into its dark, timeless grip. The moment Lena's hollow eyes met his, Elliot felt his breath stutter, like something was choking the air from his lungs. The quiet was gone, replaced by the heavy thrum of his own heartbeat, thudding in his chest like an echo reverberating through a vast, empty chamber. His mouth went dry, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure before him, Lena, or what was left of her, didn't move. Her feet hovering just above the ground, her form flickering with the distortion of a half-formed spectre. She looked like a shadow, only more substantial, more real, as if she were both a ghost and something else entirely. The thin, ragged dress she wore barely clung to her emaciated frame, its fabric torn and stained. Her face was the face of someone who had lived, someone who had known life but had been erased by time, pulled into some otherworldly state that no one could understand. "Help me," she repeated, her voice rasping like paper dragged over stone, an agonized whisper that pierced through the still air of the library. Elliot took a step back, his legs shaking beneath him. He couldn't tear his gaze away from her, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to leave, to get out before it was too late. But there was something in her expression, a deep, insistent pull that locked him in place. There was something familiar about the way she looked at him, as though she were not just a victim of some incomprehensible force, but perhaps a reflection of something he had yet to understand. Her hand, if it could still be called a hand, rose. Slowly, fingers bent at unnatural angles, the joints popping as it moved. She extended it toward him, the air around it shimmering as if the very space were bending to her will. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice now a rasping plea that sounded both desperate and resigned, as if she had been asking this for a long time in ways Elliot could never comprehend. For a brief moment, his mind flared with the knowledge that he had to do something, he had to help her. But before he could process the thought, something shifted. The atmosphere itself twisted. A low, rumbling sound reverberated from deep within the walls of the library, like the building itself was awakening, shifting, as though the foundation were groaning under some immense weight. Elliot's eyes darted to the shelves, and that's when he saw it, the books. The shelves, once filled with the comforting weight of knowledge and history, were now shifting. Books were moving, sliding across the shelves of their own accord. The ones that had been left behind, scattered on the floor, now floated in mid-air, their pages fluttering wildly as if the air had become charged with an unseen force. The library, it seemed, was alive in a way he couldn't grasp. Lena didn't move, her vacant eyes still fixed on him, her hand outstretched, the air around her thickening, growing colder. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a low hum, a vibration that echoed through the room, vibrating in his teeth, in his bones. The sudden realization struck Elliot like a slap. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something worse. Something tied to the very fabric of the library itself. "Lena," he breathed, though the word felt foreign on his tongue. It was as if her name alone was enough to unlock something in the library, as though calling her name had triggered the awakening of something ancient and far beyond his understanding. And as he spoke her name, the room seemed to darken. The shelves trembled, and the books began to rattle violently. Something was moving within the walls themselves, something large and ancient, something that had been sleeping for years. A sound like the creaking of wood echoed around him, followed by an oppressive silence that pressed on him from all sides. Lena's face twisted, her mouth opening wider, stretching impossibly, as if it were being pulled by some unseen force. Her voice now rose, a harsh, broken shriek that seemed to reverberate through the very air around them. The words she spoke were unintelligible, a garbled mess of sounds, but the meaning was clear. She was in pain. Elliot took a stumbling step forward, driven by the impulse to do something, to help her. But as his foot hit the ground, the library seemed to respond, the floor beneath him warping, twisting as though the foundation were bending to the will of the entity. The walls groaned as if something was trying to escape from within them. And then the air itself thickened with something foul, a stench like rot and decay. It was the smell of a place long forgotten, a place abandoned to time. The library itself was alive. Lena's form flickered again, the edges of her body distorting like smoke caught in the wind. Her once beautiful face had become a horror, stretched and cracked, the skin pulled too tight, her eyes dark pits that seemed to swallow everything around them. She looked less like the student she once was and more like a vessel, a conduit for whatever ancient thing had been trapped here all these years. Elliot staggered back, his hands trembling, his breath shallow. The sense of wrongness, the overwhelming feeling that this place had never been safe, that it had always been cursed, crashed into him, overwhelming him, drowning him in its weight. He had to get out. But as he turned toward the exit, the library did not let him go. The doors, the heavy wooden doors he had walked through just hours before, slammed shut with a deafening boom, locking him inside. The shadow in the hallway appeared again, moving toward him, but this time it wasn't just a shadow. The figure, once fleeting, was now fully formed, standing at the end of the aisle. Lena's twisted form flickered and writhed beside it, her hands clawing at the air, and the shadow wasn't alone. Elliot's eyes widened. From the darkness, more figures began to appear, each one a distorted version of something human, something lost, something trapped within the library's cursed walls. Their eyes, black and endless, fixated on him, their mouths opening in unison, a low, guttural chant rising from their throats. "Help us," they whispered, their voices blending together in a grotesque chorus. Each whisper held a layer of agony, of despair. The library was feeding on their pain, and they weren't the only ones. Suddenly it clicked. The library had always been this way. Lena was the key. Her disappearance had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited whatever dark force had settled in these walls. The lost students, the whispers, the strange occurrences. It was all connected. The library had claimed them one by one, binding them to its cursed existence. Elliot's blood ran cold. He knew deep down that the entity was not just a haunting. It was an ancient force tied to this place, to the very foundation of the library. It had been feeding, growing stronger with each new soul it trapped within its walls, and now it was trying to claim him. He turned back to Lena, his heart hammering in his chest. Her eyes were locked onto him, pleading. But there was no compassion in her gaze, no trace of the person she had once been. She was no longer a student, no longer human. She was part of the thing that had kept this place alive, trapped in an endless loop of suffering. "Help me," she whispered again. And this time, the words echoed in his mind like a broken record. Sue. Walls closed in around him. The figures in the shadows advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. The library itself began to pulse, the space bending, twisting, as if the building were alive, pulling him into its depths. Elliot realized then what he had to do. He had to make a choice. To save himself, he had to release them. But doing so meant confronting the very thing that had bound them all to this place, the entity that had consumed their souls, piece by piece, and left their broken, twisted remnants behind. Elliot's hand moved to his chest, the sharp pain of panic shooting through his veins. He was terrified, and yet there was something else now, a clarity. He knew what he had to do, but it might cost him everything. Elliot's body felt heavy, weighed down by the very air in the library. It pressed against his chest, constricted his lungs, making each breath feel like an impossible task. His pulse hammered in his ears, the rhythm erratic and wild. He turned to face Lena's twisted, flickering form, her hollow eyes still locked on him, still pleading with him. But there was no trace of the girl she once had been. The figure before him was a broken thing, her soul torn, fragmented, forever entwined with whatever darkness had taken root in this library. The shadows shifted, moving closer, their forms now solidified, the unnatural figures crowding around him. They were the lost souls of the library, students, faculty, people who had come before, all bound to this place, trapped in the same relentless cycle of torment. Their faces, their eyes were empty. Their mouths moved, but the words that emerged were not their own. They were echoes of 1,000 desperate voices, each one begging for release, each one whispering the same thing. Help us. The whispers rose into a crescendo, a deafening chant that reverberated through the walls, shaking the foundation of the library itself. Elliot pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound pierced through, forcing its way into his mind. He couldn't escape, and it was the thing that had always been here. It was the source of the whispers, the shifting books, the unsettling presence that had haunted him since the moment he stepped into the library. The entity, this ancient, malignant force, had been feeding off the suffering of those trapped within its walls. And Lena had been the first, the catalyst that had set everything into motion. Her eyes glowed faintly now, an eerie light flickering in the black voids where her pupils should have been. The figures around her, those who had once been students, those who had been consumed by the entity, shifted in unison, their bodies moving like puppets on strings. They advanced slowly, relentlessly, and though their hands were outstretched toward him, their faces were not filled with hunger or malice. No, their eyes were empty, yearning only for escape, for release. Elliot's heart pounded harder. He felt the weight of their presence, the collective energy of so many lost souls, pushing against him. This was no longer just a haunting. This was a prison, and he was now a part of it. His gaze locked onto the shadowy form of Lena, whose mouth twitched, as if trying to speak through the pain that radiated from her every movement. Her voice, barely a whisper, broke through the fog of his thoughts. "You have to break it," she rasped. "You have to break the bond." The words hit him like a blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. Break the bond? What bond? What was she talking about? What did he need to do to set them free? To escape himself? Suddenly the truth came crashing down upon him like a wave of ice-cold water. His mind flashed back to the book he had found earlier, the one with Lena's name on the pages, the one that had been placed in that forgotten aisle. The library, the books themselves, they were the key. The entity wasn't just tied to the library physically, it was bound to the very knowledge contained within it, the cursed texts, the forbidden knowledge that had drawn Lena here in the first place. She hadn't just disappeared, she had been consumed. The realization hit Elliot like a bolt of lightning. The entity was not simply haunting the library, it was using the knowledge stored within it to feed, to grow, to pull more and more souls into its dark grip. The library had become a vessel for something ancient, something powerful, and it had been feeding on the fear and the suffering of every soul that had crossed its threshold. But there was a way out, a way to break the cycle, a way to destroy the entity. "I have to destroy the books," Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. It was the only solution, the only way to stop this madness. But the thought of it terrified him. The library was vast, the shelves stretched on forever, filled with texts that held centuries of knowledge, of history, of power. Could he really destroy it all? Could he truly erase the thing that had bound them all? Lena's form flickered, her eyes narrowing as she raised her hand, gesturing toward the center of the room. The shadows seemed to gather there, swirling together, like smoke, forming into something far darker, more threatening. A shape began to take form, a large, looming figure that seemed to block out the light. It was the entity itself, the thing that had been feeding on them all. Elliot's breath hitched as the figure loomed over him. It was a twisted mass of shadow and smoke with eyes that gleamed like blackened glass, hollow and endless. Its form shifted and warped, a reflection of all the souls it had consumed, all the fear it had fed on. The whispers from the lost souls had turned into an overwhelming roar, filling his mind with chaotic thoughts, desperate cries for help. "You cannot escape," the entity's voice rumbled, deep and unearthly, a sound that seemed to reverberate from the very walls. "You are part of me now." Elliot's knees buckled beneath the weight of those words. The library was no longer just a building. It had become a living, breathing entity, its walls pulsing with an unnatural energy. The books around him seemed to hum with dark power, each one a potential conduit for the entity's influence. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't let it win. The entity moved toward him, its dark tendrils reaching out, pulling at the edges of his consciousness, threatening to drown him in its oppressive presence. But then, just as he felt his resolve starting to crack, a flash of clarity cut through the fog of fear. The books. The books were the source. They were the heart of it all. He had to find the heart of the curse, the source of the entity's power, and destroy it. It wasn't enough to burn the books, to throw them into a fire. The entity was bound to the library itself, to the knowledge it contained. The only way to destroy it was to sever its connection to the world. His gaze flicked toward Lena, her twisted form still flickering in the shadows. She was looking at him, her eyes wide, pleading silently. In that moment, Elliot understood. She was not just a victim. She was part of this curse. She had been consumed by it, but she had also become its tether. The connection between the library and the entity was inescapably linked to her. He had to free her. He had to destroy the heart of the library, where the entity's power was rooted, and free Lena's soul, and the souls of all the others trapped within its walls. As if on cue, the bookshelves around him began to tremble, the air thickening with an unnatural energy. The shadows gathered, swirling around him, pushing him toward the center of the library, where the darkest of the books were stored. He could feel it now, the pulse, the heartbeat of the entity itself, calling him toward it. The price of salvation was clear. He would have to sacrifice everything to break the bond. But was he willing to pay it? Elliot's heart pounded as he began to move toward the center of the room, his steps heavy, his mind clouded with doubt. The shadows closed in on him, but he kept walking, one foot in front of the other. The library was no longer just a building to him. It was a prison, and its walls were closing in. He could feel it. The end was near. But would it be his salvation or his doom? The air in the library was thick, too thick, like a dense fog pressing in from all sides. Each breath felt heavier than the last, as if the very atmosphere was resisting him, pulling him back, trying to keep him in the dark heart of this cursed place. The shadows, once faint and distant, now pressed close around him, their shapes flickering and twisting in the corners of his vision. They were more than just shadows now. They were the remnants of all the souls who had been consumed, distorted into grotesque mockeries of their former selves. Elliot moved deeper into the library, his feet dragging against the floor as if the ground itself was trying to hold him in place. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of desperate voices filling the space around him. "Help me!" they begged, their words blending together in a distorted chorus that sent chills down his spine. He could no longer tell where the voices of the lost souls ended and the whispers of the entity began. They had become one and the same. The figure of Lena flickered before him again, her broken form hovering just beyond his reach. Her face was twisted in pain, her mouth open in a silent scream that echoed in his mind. She was trapped, bound to the library, to the entity, her soul ripped apart and scattered across the dark corners of this place. And now, she was nothing more than a vessel for the horror that had taken root here. "Help me," she whispered again, the sound tearing at his resolve. But this time, something in the way she said it made his stomach twist. There was a hint of something else in her voice, something that wasn't just despair. It was a warning. Elliot halted in his tracks. The words clung to him, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. Help me. He had to, he knew that. He had to destroy the entity, to sever the bond that had trapped all these souls. But Lena, was she truly begging for release? Or was she part of the curse, a piece of the darkness that had overtaken this place? The shadows began to stir around him, moving with an unnatural fluidity. They closed in, slipping between the aisles of books, their forms becoming more distinct with every passing moment. The entity was growing stronger, feeding off the fear that radiated from him. Elliot could feel it pressing on his chest, like a weight that threatened to crush him. The shadows reached out, their fingers like claws brushing against his skin. He could hear their low, guttural murmurs, their voices distorted, overlapping, each one a whisper of a soul long lost to this place. Elliot's mind raced. The books, the library itself, was the source. He had known that from the beginning. But now, it felt as if the very walls were alive, pulsing with a dark energy that was both suffocating and intoxicating. The library was no longer just a building. It was a sentient being, a prison that had been feeding on the souls of the lost for years, possibly centuries, and it was trying to claim him now. His gaze fell on the books in front of him. Shelves upon shelves of them, their pages filled with forbidden knowledge, their spines worn and cracked. Some of them were already vibrating, shaking as if alive, their energy swirling around him. The thought of destroying them seemed impossible. The knowledge contained within them was vast, ancient. To destroy them would be to erase centuries of history, of learning. But what good was knowledge if it only served to feed something dark, something that had already claimed so many lives? Elliot gritted his teeth, his fists tightening at his sides. There was no choice. The entity was bound to the library, and the only way to free the souls trapped within was to destroy the heart of the curse. But to do that, he would have to sever the connection between the library and the entity. He had to destroy the books, the knowledge, and the very foundation that kept it alive. His breath quickened. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, of all the lost souls, of Lena, of the entity itself, watching, waiting. He was the only one who could do it. He was the one who had been chosen, whether he wanted it or not. Lena's form flickered again, her eyes searching his face, her mouth opening, as if to speak. "Please," she whispered, and for a moment, Elliot thought he saw something in her expression, something like remorse, something like hope. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the hollow emptiness that had consumed her. He swallowed hard, stepping toward the center of the room. The shadows pressed closer, wrapping around him, but he didn't stop. The air seemed to thicken, pushing against him, making every movement feel like he was wading through water. But he had to move forward. He had to end this. Elliot reached the center of the library where the bookshelves towered around him, a fortress of knowledge. The shadows were now all around him, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The figure of the entity was there, looming, a massive presence that filled the entire room, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent intelligence. "You cannot escape," the entity rumbled, its voice deep and endless, a vibration that shook the very ground beneath him. "You are mine." Elliot's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The entity's power was palpable now, thick in the air, suffocating. He could feel its tendrils stretching out toward him, probing his mind, seeking to pull him into its grasp, but he refused to give in. He had come too far. With a deep breath, he reached out and grasped the nearest book, its spine cold and heavy beneath his fingers. The moment his touch made contact, the air around him shifted. The library groaned, the shelves rattling, as if the entire building were waking up, stirring from its slumber. The shadows shrieked, their forms swirling, churning in the corners of his vision. Then, without hesitation, Elliot ripped the book from the shelf. The moment the book left its place, the library screamed. It was a sound unlike anything Elliot had ever heard. A deafening primal scream that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the building. The walls shook violently, the floor beneath him cracking as if the library was splitting open, its ancient foundation crumbling. The air thickened, pulsing with the force of the entity's anger, its desperation. But Elliot didn't stop. He had made his choice. One by one, he began to tear the books from their shelves, their pages fluttering in the air like trapped birds. The shadows screamed, but their voices were drowned out by the deafening noise of the library falling apart. The entity fought against him, its presence pressing in, its power clawing at his mind, but he kept going, ripping the books, destroying the knowledge that had bound it to this place. And as the last book fell from the shelf, the entity let out one final soul-ripping scream. The library trembled. Elliot felt a cold, searing pain in his chest, as if the very life had been drained from him. His vision blurred, the edges of the world fading in and out of focus. But he didn't look away. He couldn't. Lena's form appeared before him once more, her broken face now calm, serene even. Her eyes, once hollow, now held a flicker of life, something human. She stepped toward him, her hand outstretched, her voice soft, almost grateful. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The darkness around him began to dissipate, the oppressive weight lifting from his shoulders. The library groaned one final time, the walls cracking, the shelves crumbling into dust. And then, as the last echo of the entity faded, there was silence. Elliot fell to his knees, his strength spent, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The library around him was still, its oppressive presence gone. The whispers had stopped, the souls had been freed. But at what cost? Lena's form flickered, her face a haunting reflection of the person she had once been. "You did it," she whispered. "But now, you must go." Elliot blinked, confusion washing over him. What did she mean? Hadn't he already done it? Hadn't he already freed them all? But as the darkness began to pull her form back into the shadows, Lena's voice echoed one last time, a soft, tragic whisper. Goodbye. And then the library was empty. Elliot was alone. The library was quiet. Too quiet. Elliot stood in the center of the cavernous room, his breath shallow, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. The shelves, once filled with ancient tomes and forbidden knowledge, now stood empty. The air, heavy with the scent of old paper and dust, had lost its oppressive quality. There was no more whispering, no more shadows lurking just beyond sight. The entity, the dark presence that had consumed, everything was gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the library was still, but the silence was deafening. Elliot's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his body shaking with exhaustion. He felt as though every ounce of strength had been drained from him, as though the very essence of his being had been siphoned away. His mind was a haze, the events of the past hours running together in a blur of shadows, whispers, and screams. The weight of his choices, the destruction, the sacrifice, the breaking of the bond, was crushing him. What had he done? Was he free? Had he truly ended the curse? Or had he simply opened a door to a new nightmare? The walls of the library around him seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though the building itself were recovering from the turmoil. But there was no sign of the entity, no sign of the lost souls that had once filled the aisles. The whispers were gone. And yet a part of him still felt that unshakable presence, that sense of being watched, as though the library's history had seeped into his very bones, leaving a mark that would never fade. Elliot closed his eyes and rubbed his face, trying to clear the fog from his mind. His hands were trembling, slick with sweat, but his head ached, a deep, pulsing throb that seemed to echo the chaos of the past hours. He had saved the souls trapped within the library's walls. He had freed them from the clutches of the entity, but at what cost? The shadow of Lena still haunted him, her broken, flickering form etched into his mind. He hadn't been able to save her. Her soul had been ripped apart, her body twisted into something beyond recognition. Had he truly freed her? Or had she simply been another casualty in a war between the living and the dead? His gaze flicked to the far end of the library, where the grand doors loomed. They had been closed when he tried to escape before, but now they were wide open, the dim light of the outside world streaming in. The heavy wooden doors creaked in, the silence, their hinges groaning as if reluctant to let him go. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, his body fighting against him as he stumbled toward the exit. The library's eerie stillness followed him, a presence that seemed to cling to him, wrapping around him like a second skin. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back one last time at the room that had become his prison, his battleground. The shelves were gone, replaced by empty space. The remnants of the books, now nothing more than dust and decay, scattered on the floor like fallen leaves. The library that had once been a place of knowledge, of learning, was now a hollow shell. Elliot felt a pang of sorrow, not just for Lena, but for all of it. The lost souls, the cursed knowledge, the history that had been erased. He had destroyed it all, but in doing so, had he also destroyed something essential? Was there anything left of the library, or had he truly erased its legacy? He took a deep breath and stepped through the door, into the bright, open air of the outside world. The sunlight felt strange against his skin, as if he had forgotten what it was like to feel warmth, to be surrounded by the living. The cool breeze ruffled his hair, carrying with it the faint scent of grass and earth. He looked up at the sky, the vast, endless expanse above him, and for a moment he thought he saw something, someone, in the distance. A figure, just on the edge of his vision, standing between the trees. Elliot's heart stilled. He blinked, and when his eyes refocused, the figure was gone. He frowned, his stomach twisting. The library had been destroyed, the entity defeated. There was no reason for him to still feel like this. He had done what he needed to do. He had won. And yet, as he began to walk away from the library, something pulled at him, an unshakable feeling that he was not truly free. A gnawing sensation, like a seed of doubt planted deep within him. The further he walked, the stronger it became. The unease in his chest grew, as if something was still watching him, still lingering at the edges of his perception. He turned around, his heart racing, but there was nothing. The campus was quiet, peaceful even. Students were scattered about, walking across the lawn, chatting with one another, lost in their own world, the world he had left behind. The world that was, for all intents and purposes, normal again. But Elliot knew something had followed him. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It's nothing. You're free now. You've done it. But then the whisper came. A faint, chilling echo on the wind, so soft at first that he almost didn't hear it. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, closer, the sound of it sinking into his skin, burrowing into his mind. Help me. It was the same voice. Lena. But no. No. He had freed her, he had broken the bond. He had destroyed the entity. And yet her voice, faint, desperate, echoed in his mind, as if she was still there, still somewhere between the living and the dead, somewhere between the walls of the library. It was as though the library itself had left a scar on his soul, a permanent mark that could never be erased. Elliot took a step forward, his body trembling. He could still hear her whisper, feel the pull of the darkness. And as he looked back at the towering form of the library, now nothing more than an empty shell, a single question lodged itself deep in his mind. Had he truly destroyed the curse, or had he merely set it free? The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of a laugh. And in that moment, Elliot knew the library would never truly let him go. The sun, pale and weak in the sky, cast long, twisted shadows over the campus, stretching across the lawn like dark fingers, reaching out from the very earth itself. Elliot stood at the edge of the library's remnants, staring at the empty expanse where the grand building had once stood. There was nothing left but the decaying foundation, the darkened silhouette of its crumbling walls barely visible beneath the encroaching ivy. The wind rustled through the trees, but the sounds were hollow, distant, as if the world had been muted. But that whisper, the one that had crept into his mind, so soft, so insistent, hadn't faded. It continued to echo in his ears even as the world around him seemed to settle into an unnatural calm. Help me. The words, barely audible, made his heart thump painfully in his chest. He was free. He had done it, hadn't he? The library had fallen, the books destroyed, the entity vanquished. The souls were released. He had made the sacrifice. He had ended it all. Yet, the voice still lingered, like a shadow that clung to him, refusing to be shaken. He spun around, searching for the source. The campus was quiet. Too quiet. The other students were going about their day, oblivious to what had happened. They moved like shadows themselves, each of them nothing more than a distant figure, lost in the light of a world that seemed too bright, too normal, too wrong for the nightmare Elliot had just lived. He turned toward the path leading away from the library's foundation, a subtle pull tugging at his feet. It was a feeling that hadn't gone away since he'd stepped outside, this gnawing sense that something was still watching him, still waiting. The trees along the path swayed gently, their branches whispering in the breeze, but the sounds they made were wrong, distorted, echoes of something older, deeper, something that didn't belong to the world of sunlight and ordinary life. Help me. This time, the whisper wasn't in his mind. It was real. A voice. Her voice. Elliot's body froze. His breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. He turned slowly, almost afraid to look, but unable to stop himself. He had to know. He had to see. There, at the edge of the campus, near the line of trees, stood a figure. Lena. Her form was shadowed and indistinct, but it was her. He could feel it. The figure was bent, almost crumpled, as if it were being pulled by something invisible, something that tethered it to the earth, to this world, to the library. She looked so fragile, so broken, her once beautiful face twisted in agony, her eyes hollow, staring into him with a pleading desperation that sent a chill creeping down his spine. "Help me." Her voice broke the air, a rasping whisper that seemed to crawl along his skin like 1,000 fingers. It was louder this time, and yet it still felt like it came from somewhere far away, as though the space between them was stretching, making the distance impossible to cross. Elliot's breath caught. He stumbled back, his hands gripping the edges of the nearest tree for support. He was still shaken, the weight of his actions, the destruction, the sacrifice, bearing down on him. But this was beyond anything he could have prepared for. Lena's figure remained motionless, as if she were waiting for him, her outstretched hand trembling ever so slightly. The expression on her face was one of sorrow, yes, but something darker lingered beneath it, something unnatural. A coldness that chilled him to the bone. I freed you," Elliot whispered, his voice breaking as he spoke. The words tasted wrong in his mouth, hollow, like he was trying to convince himself. "I destroyed the entity. I ended it. You're free now." But Lena didn't respond. Instead, her form flickered, twisting like smoke caught in the wind. Her eyes glinted, dark and endless, as the shadows around her began to pulse, growing thicker, darker. The air grew heavy with an oppressive force, a tangible weight that seemed to press on him from all sides. "Help me." The words came again, this time not as a whisper, but as a sharp, anguished scream that pierced his mind. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the trees seemed to bend toward the figure of Lena, their branches reaching out, stretching, their shadows lengthening and distorting. "No," Elliot thought, panic rising in his chest. "This isn't real. She's not real. It's not possible." But despite the growing horror in his chest, he knew deep down that this was not just a hallucination. Lena was here. She was still here. She was still tethered to the library, to the curse that had been broken, but never fully undone. The entity had been defeated, but not destroyed. It had been freed. It had slipped from the bindings that had kept it in the library, slipping into the world like a shadow, unseen but still present, lurking in the places where it had once reigned. The whisper, the voice of Lena, it was no longer just a plea. It was an invitation. An invitation to step back into the darkness, to take his place among the souls that had been consumed. Elliot's heart pounded as realization crashed into him like a wave. The entity had been waiting for this. It had never truly been bound to the library. The library had only been a vessel, a conduit. The real power had always been in the curse itself, in the souls it had consumed, in the dark knowledge it had accumulated. Lena wasn't the last soul to be claimed, and he wasn't just a witness. He was a part of it now. The library had left its mark on him. It had chosen him. His breath quickened as the shadows around him began to shift again, pulling toward him like a tide. The wind stirred, dark and cold, swirling around his body as if the world itself were turning on him, wrapping him in its grasp. The trees bent and twisted unnaturally, their branches becoming skeletal hands reaching toward him, pulling him back toward the figure of Lena. And then, with terrifying clarity, he understood. He had never left the library. The world around him, the campus, the sun, the trees, was just a veil, a thin mask that had been placed over the true world of shadows and whispers. The library was still there, still calling him back, still pulling at him like a magnet. The curse had followed him. He had never truly escaped. Lena's figure began to materialize, the shadows around her coalescing into a twisted, darker form. She stepped forward, her broken, spectral hand still outstretched toward him, her mouth opening again to speak. "Help me." This time the voice was not a whisper. It was a command, a beckoning. Elliot's mind raced, his heart tearing in two. He couldn't fight it. He had destroyed the library, but the darkness it carried, the curse it had unleashed, was far older than anything he could have known. The library had been the gateway, but the true horror, the entity, had never been bound. It had simply been waiting. The figures from the library, the shadows of the lost souls, began to crowd around him. They were everywhere, their twisted forms flickering like ghosts. Lena's final words echoed in his mind, a cruel reminder of the fate that awaited him. You can't escape. You never will. And as the shadows closed in, as the dark void of the entity swallowed the light around him, Elliot realized the truth. He hadn't freed the souls. He had become one of them. The library's curse had never ended. It had simply been waiting for someone else to take its place. And now, he was its keeper. There was no light, no wind, no time, just silence, thick and absolute. Elliot opened his eyes, or thought he did. Darkness pressed against him from all sides, not the kind born of absence but of presence. It had weight, it had purpose, the kind of darkness that watched you back. He stood in a vast expanse that stretched in all directions, boundless but claustrophobic. His breath didn't fog. His footsteps made no sound. It was as if the very rules of the world had unraveled. There were no books here, no shelves, no library, just him and the entity. He felt it, not as a shape or figure, but as a constant pressure inside his mind. It slithered behind his thoughts, curling like smoke in the cavities of his skull. Its voice was no longer whispering from the walls or pages. It was within him now, speaking, with the same tongue Lena had used, the same voice that had whispered, "Help me." But this time, the plea was gone. Now, it instructed, "You must remember." Elliot flinched. The words weren't heard, they were remembered, as though they'd always been in him, just waiting to surface. He clutched his head, pain lancing through his temples like cold needles. "You must remember what you brought with you." Images flooded his mind, memories that didn't feel like his. A professor hunched over strange manuscripts, a candlelit study hidden beneath the library floor, a circle drawn in ash, words spoken in desperation. A girl, Lena, standing in the center, eyes wide with wonder and fear. And then, something, waking, something ancient. Elliot staggered backward, gasping, the truth twisted inside him like a splinter. Lena hadn't found the entity, she had summoned it, and he had helped her. They had done it together. His hands trembled. It wasn't the library that had first been cursed, it was them. Two curious students grasping for truths beyond the veil, delving into rituals buried in footnotes and hidden between the lines of banned texts. Lena had been drawn to the darkness, entranced by the promise of hidden knowledge. And he had been drawn to her. He'd followed her, believed in her, trusted her. But they hadn't just awakened something old. They had unleashed it. Lena had vanished, not because the library took her, but because she had given herself to it. A willing vessel, a martyr in her own myth, and he had forgotten it all, buried it deep. The entity had fed on his denial, hiding within the cracks of his memory, growing stronger with every passing year, waiting, watching. And when he returned to the library, when he took the night shift and walked those silent aisles, it had smiled, because he was always meant to return. "You broke the seal," the voice inside him said now. "You burned the books. You ended the prison." A pause, a silence that throbbed, and you opened the door. The emptiness around him began to shift. Slowly, silently, pieces began to appear in the dark. A chair, a table, dust motes suspended in frozen air. Then shelves, hundreds of them, growing from the void like bones pushing through skin. The scent of old pages crept into the air, musty and dry. The library was rebuilding itself piece by piece, memory by memory. He was rebuilding it. No, Elliot whispered, his voice raw. But it was happening. He could feel the darkness winding around him like ivy, threading itself through his thoughts, stitching him to the foundation. Not as a prisoner, not anymore, as the keeper. This was the sacrifice. This was the price. Not destruction, but containment. He had burned the knowledge that kept the entity confined, shattered the chains that bound it. And now, to protect the world from the thing he helped unleash, he had become the new lock, the new seal, the new librarian of a library that no longer belonged to the world of the living. A single chair emerged from the void, high-backed, wooden, familiar. He knew it. He had sat there before Lena disappeared, before he forgot. A thick, leather-bound tome rested on the table. Its cover was blank, but he could feel it calling to him. He walked to it slowly, knees weak, throat dry. His hand hovered over the cover. And then the whisper came. Not from the void, not from the entity, but from himself. "You must remember. You must record." Because this was his task now, to keep the knowledge. To keep the curse contained. To keep the world from remembering what lies beneath the words, between the pages, inside the whispers. His fingers touched the book. It opened. The pages inside were empty, waiting, and as he sat, the shadows shifted. The shelves loomed. The candles lit themselves. The air turned still. The library had returned, not to the campus, not to the world, but to him. And now, in this place beyond time, beyond reality, Elliot began to write. In a quiet corner of the campus grounds, where ivy grows thick over stone, there is a hollow where a building once stood. Students say a library used to be there, though no one remembers what happened to it. Sometimes at 3 a.m. when the wind is just right, you can hear pages turning from somewhere far below, and a whisper, just one, soft, tired and eternal. "Help me." The ink bled slow and thick from the tip of the quill. Elliot's hand moved as if guided by invisible threads, his fingers steady even though his mind frayed at the edges. The words that spilled across the page were not his, not entirely. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. They weren't memories. They were echoes, shards of lives, of thoughts, of terror. Names appeared first. Long lists of names, students, staff, visitors, all gone. Each one swallowed by the library across time, their voices now trapped in the paper fibers he scribbled over, as if the pages themselves breathed with suffering. And Elliot, he knew them. Somehow, impossibly, he remembered them all, because the library remembered. It was memory now. And its living archive. A A page turned itself. The air around him shifted subtly, an old trick of the place, barely noticeable if you weren't attuned to the way the space lived. In the corner, a chair moved. A shelf grew taller. The whisper of footsteps echoed faintly, though there was no one there. But Elliot had learned to listen, to interpret. He paused, a ripple in the fabric of silence, a new presence, faint but growing stronger, brushing against the edges of the library's boundaries. A mind, unaware, curious, and far too close. Someone was trying to find the library, not physically, but mentally, in dreams, perhaps, in obsession, in grief, the old patterns, the same hooks that had caught Lena, and before her, others, always others. Elliot stood. His chair creaked softly behind him, fading into the gloom as the shelves shifted, adjusting their positions with quiet groans. He walked through the rows now, barefoot, the floor impossibly cold beneath him. Each shelf whispered as he passed, fragments of voices rising up, begging, bargaining, confessing. He didn't answer. He had his task. The intrusion grew louder in his mind. A name started to form, a young woman perhaps, restless, her grief raw. She'd lost someone, a sister, a friend. And now she was searching, eyes wide and desperate, tearing through books and archives, trying to uncover the mystery of the old. Building that used to be there. Elliot reached the door. It was a plain thing. Oak, iron-bound, set into a brick wall that hadn't been there a moment before. That was the way of the library. It built itself around the needs of the moment. And someone was knocking now, not with hands but with memory, with longing. He placed his hand on the door. A flicker of pain lanced through his palm. The brand was still there, a blackened sigil that pulsed faintly beneath his skin, burned into him when he took the roll, when the entity passed through him and made its home in his bones. He opened the door, and there she was, not in the flesh, not yet, but in vision. A girl hunched over a desk, back in the waking world. She was surrounded by microfilm, old news clippings, records that shouldn't exist, but had slipped through the cracks. On her screen, an article from 13 years ago, buried and redacted, titled "Campus Library Closes After Second Disappearance." She was close. Too close. And the library had noticed. Elliot stepped back and closed the door. The walls around him moaned gently, like a great beast disturbed from sleep. The candlelight flickered and dimmed. Books on the shelves began to rattle. Pages turned themselves. The air grew heavier, the pressure building in his skull, because it was happening again. The pattern was returning. They always returned. That was the cruel irony of the curse. People forgot the building, yes, but not the absence of it, a vacuum of memory, a scar in the ground where something once stood. And some, like her, could feel it. The empty space tugged at certain minds like a loose thread. All it took was grief, curiosity, guilt. Just like him, just like Lena. Elliot knew what came next. She would start dreaming of the place. Hallways with no end, shelves that grew the harder you tried to map them, whispers, soft at first, then louder, familiar names written in books she'd never opened. The sound of turning pages when no one else was in the room, and at 3 a.m. she would hear the knock, on a door that shouldn't be there. Elliot moved back to the desk. He sat. He picked up the quill again and began to write her name, not to summon her. No, he had learned that mistake, but to prepare. Because now that the library had found her, now that it had fixed its eye upon her soul, she would have only two choices: be consumed, or replace the keeper. His hand trembled slightly as he inked the last letter. The name burned faintly into the page. He closed the book. And somewhere, in a dorm room, Not far from the ivy-covered crater, a girl sat up in bed, heart pounding, the echo of a whisper still curling in her ear. "Help me," the library remembers, and it waits, and it writes. At first it was only in her sleep. Small things, a hallway that didn't belong in her dorm building, a door at the end of it, dark wood, bound in iron, with no handle and no number. The door never opened. It only waited, always at the edge of her dreams, watching her the way an unopened book watches a curious hand. Mira didn't remember dreaming often. But after she found that article, the one no one else seemed to remember, the one about the second disappearance on campus, the dreams began every night, and the door was always there. Each morning she woke drenched in sweat, the air in her room cold, her blankets kicked to the floor. At first she dismissed it. Stress, maybe. Grief, most likely. After all, it hadn't been long since she lost Sam, her sister. Gone. The grief hadn't dulled. It had sharpened, like a needle buried under skin, finding its way to the surface. But what Mira couldn't explain, what she didn't dare try to, is that since Sam died, she'd felt something strange. Like her sister hadn't vanished completely, as though some piece of her still lingered in the spaces where silence stretched too long, in the corner of her room, in the flicker of the dorm hallway light, in the whisper that never quite formed words, in the door that waited in every dream. It was Sam's voice she heard, wasn't it? Faint, fractured, "Help me." And then, just 3 nights ago, the dream changed. The door opened. Inside was a room that shouldn't exist. A tall, vaulted space filled with towering shelves that stretched too far to see the top. The air was still, the dust frozen mid-air like suspended breath. Rows of candlelight flickered without flame. Books whispered to one another. Paper shifted with no wind. Mira stepped through. The door shut behind her. She didn't remember waking. Only the sound. The scream. Her own, maybe. Now she wasn't sure if she was dreaming at all anymore, because the door had followed her, not just in sleep. It appeared in the reflection of windows, lingering behind her in glass displays at the history building. She caught it drawn faintly in the corners of her notebooks, in lines she didn't remember writing. And then, this morning, carved lightly, delicately, into the paint beneath her bed. The same wood, the same iron, the same door. She wasn't dreaming anymore. She was being called. That afternoon, Mira returned to the archives beneath the English department. A space no one ever seemed to monitor. She'd been down here before, but now she moved with urgency, with instinct. She found the floor plans of the campus from the 1980s. There it was, the library, exactly where the overgrown crater now sat. She traced the lines of the building's design with her fingertip. A hollow rectangle, a missing piece. The center of the library floor plan was blank. No stairwells, no elevators, no corridors, just a void. Her skin went cold. Something about that. Empty space tugged at her deep in her chest. She felt the strange familiarity again, like déjà vu wrapped in grief. Like Sam had been here. Like Sam had gone there. Mira pulled out the microfiche reader, loading in the reel she'd found by chance, tucked at the back of the drawer. The grainy headline flickered into view. Second disappearance linked to campus library. Student volunteer missing. After overnight shift. The photo was blurry, but the face was unmistakable. Young, pale, slightly hunched, like the weight of something. Unseen had bowed his shoulders. Elliot. Beneath the photo. Library intern, presumed missing. No remains found. Building permanently closed by administration. Records sealed. She stared at the name. Something stirred behind her eyes. A flash of dark corridors, candles flickering against. Stone, someone whispering her name before vanishing into the shelves. She should have felt fear, but what she felt instead was understanding. Mira stood, her hands trembling, the name Elliot echoing in her mind. She didn't know him, had never met him, but she had seen him, in the dream, in the library. He had been sitting at the desk, writing. She had passed by him when the door first opened and he had looked at her. His eyes, tired, ancient, had held hers for only a moment. And she'd felt a message pass between them, silent but loud as thunder. You're next. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on her bed, the lights off, waiting for the whisper, for the knock, for whatever came next. The wind outside was still. Then, at 3 a.m. exactly, a sound, 3 knocks, not on her door, but from the space beneath her bed. She knelt slowly, pulled the sheet aside, and there it was. Not a floor. Not the concrete she knew from months in this dorm. A door, old wood, iron-bound, no handle, no number. But this time, there was something new. A name carved into the frame, Mira Hawthorne. Her mouth went dry. Her fingers reached out, barely touching. The edge, and from beyond it, faint, fragile, unmistakable, came a voice she knew better than her own. Help me, Mira. Sam. Alive. No, not alive. But somewhere. And the door. It was open now. Mira inhaled, then whispered, I'm coming, and stepped through. Far below the waking world, Elliot sat at his desk. He looked up. He felt her enter. A candle flared too, life on a distant shelf. A new corridor opened behind the biography section, and the library stirred. He sighed, turned to a fresh page, and wrote her name. The moment Mira crossed the threshold, the world forgot her. Her dorm bed still held the impression of her body. Her laptop remained open, cursor blinking patiently beside the search term, Library Disappearance, Elliott College, 2012. Her tea had gone cold on the windowsill, but no one would notice. She had joined the fold now. She had become a whisper. The door closed behind her without sound, sealing shut with no hinges, no handle, no return. The darkness welcomed her like a breath inhaling, heavy, moist, ancient. It didn't press in on her, it pulled like gravity, not downward but inward, as if she were falling into the spine of a book too thick to read, too old to name. No footsteps echoed in this place. The silence didn't come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of listening. Something here was always listening. Her eyes adjusted slowly. Candlelight lined the shelves, some burning blue, others deep crimson. The books whispered. As she passed, their pages rustling as though wind passed through them, though the air was still. She wandered deeper. She should have been afraid. But she wasn't. Not exactly. Because grief has its own gravity, and hers had long since pulled her past fear. Sam? She called softly, but her voice didn't echo. It was swallowed immediately, pulled into the wooden walls like ink into parchment. Still, something stirred. Far off. A tremor of presence. She pressed on, fingers grazing the spines of the books. Each one shuddered at her touch. Titles blurred as she looked at them, her mind rejecting the words, her eyes refusing to hold them. Except one, a small, green volume resting open on a stand of bone. Her name glowed faintly on the open page. Mira Hawthorne status, unbound roll, supplicant objective. Retrieval, beneath that, scrawled in ink so dark it bled into the paper. If she finds what was lost, she may become what is needed. Mira blinked. What was needed? A sound came from behind the shelves. A soft, familiar laugh. She turned sharply. Sam? She said again, louder this time. No answer, only that laugh, now echoing gently. It was her sister's laugh, but not full, not whole. Like a recording warped by time. like something trying to be her sister. Still, Mira followed it. The library changed as she walked. Shelves realigned behind her. Lights shifted. The corridor she passed through no longer existed when she turned back to look. It was not a place that could be explored, only obeyed. It wanted her to go somewhere. It was guiding her. The laugh stopped, replaced by a whisper. "Help me." And this time she heard it clearly. It was Sam's voice, yes, but layered beneath it was another, fainter, fragile. "Elliot, don't trust it," he said. "Don't trust it. It lies." Mira froze. The corridor split ahead, forked like a torn page. To the left, warm light, soft and golden, like childhood afternoons. She heard Sam's voice again, calling her, singing softly, a melody from their grandmother's kitchen. To the right, darkness, pure and complete. But within it, she heard a scratching, quill on paper, steady, relentless. She took one step toward the golden light, toward the warmth. But her grief caught her wrist, held her in place. She turned right. Elliot looked up as the candle at his desk sputtered. He knew what it meant. She had turned toward truth. She had chosen the path no one chose. He closed the book before him and rose. The library groaned around. Him, sensing a shift. It hadn't expected her to resist. It had shown her comfort, illusion, the possibility of reunion, and she had turned away from it. He stepped into the archive wing, the part of the library where nothing had names, only functions. Shelves there were made of bone, sinew, and stone. Books bound in silence and written in grief. He would meet her there, if she made it. Mira stepped into the dark, and the dark welcomed her. Her body tingled with cold. Her thoughts slowed. Her memories began to blur, but she fought it. She held on to her sister's face, her sister's voice, the way Sam used to sleep with her, arm across her eyes, as if blocking out dreams. The darkness did not like that. It whispered to her. It offered her things. She saw herself again at the hospital, holding Sam's hand, watching the heart monitor flatline. But in this version, Sam opened her eyes, smiled, said, "Don't cry, I'm still here." She turned away, more illusions, more lies, until finally, a desk, a figure behind it. Elliot, older now, pale, eyes ringed with the kind of shadows that never fade. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment he looked almost relieved. "You came," he said. "I had to," she replied. "She's here, isn't she?" His expression darkened. "Some of her, not all. This place, it doesn't give you what you lost. It gives you what you want to believe. Then how do I find her?" "You don't." He stood. "You free her." Mira's breath hitched. The air around her felt thinner, like every second here was pulling the world further away. "How?" Elliot looked past her, down a corridor now opening behind her. "She's in the hollow stacks, where the names are erased. But if you go there, the library will offer you a bargain. It always does." "What kind of bargain?" "One that costs more than it gives. It will offer you reunion, wholeness. But if you accept, you will become part of it. You will stay. Like me. You stayed. I broke the seal. I opened the gate. I became the librarian to contain it. But its hunger is returning. It needs new memory, a new keeper." Mira's skin chilled. "And if I go and don't accept, then she may pass on. And you?" He smiled, faint and tired. "Then maybe I finally get to forget." He stepped aside. The corridor gaped open, and the door at the end of it, tall, black, carved in sigils that breathed, swung slowly inward. Mira stepped through. She didn't look back. Elliot sat down, picked up the quill, wrote one more name, Samantha Hawthorne, status, bound, and beneath it, supplicant in pursuit. Outcome uncertain. Deep in the hollow stacks, the entity stirred. The librarian had sent another into the maze. The library shifted in delight. It would test her now. Grief had brought her here. Love would tempt her. But sacrifice would define her. And the next chapter had already begun to write itself. The hollow stacks breathed, not in sound, but in movement. A slow, rhythmic flexing of the shelves, like lungs drawing breath in utter silence. The air was damp and warm, filled with the smell of mildew and ink long dried. The space seemed endless, but too close, like trying to walk through a memory you hadn't earned. Mira walked carefully now. She had passed the threshold. She had entered the place where names go to die. Every step she took left no mark, no sound. The floor beneath her changed with each glance, tiles turning to dirt, then to cracked stone, then to pages stitched together from unfamiliar handwriting. The walls closed in and fell away again, obeying no logic, bending to the shape of her mind. And ahead of her, the pull, a presence, a thread wound tight around her soul, drawing her forward. Sam. She was here. Mira could feel it, stronger now than ever. But Sam wasn't whole. She was fragmented. A soul, partially digested, lingering in the margins of the library's consciousness. If Mira didn't reach her in time, she would fade completely. Her name unwritten, her memory unmade, and worse still, the entity would absorb what remained. Satu, hollow stacks were its feeding ground. This was where the library lured the grieving, the desperate, the guilty. It tempted them with impossible choices, with images of the dead returned, and it offered them reunion. But the cost was always the same: their memory, their name, their self. Mira moved faster. The air grew denser. The shelves around her grew stranger, filled, with books bound in cloth, in skin, in silence. One shelf bore no titles, only long rows of open books with blank pages. But as she passed, words began to appear on the paper in real time, like a pen pressed from the inside. She comes, heavy with grief. She seeks what cannot be returned. She will be offered the same bargain all do. Will she choose the page? Or the person? She swallowed hard. And then she saw her. Sam, or something that looked like her, standing at the far end of a narrow aisle where the light seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Her face was half-shadowed, but Mira would have known, her even in the dark. That posture, that stillness. Sam, Mira whispered, her voice cracking. Sam turned. Her eyes were hollow at first, wide, unseeing, but then they filled. Recognition bloomed, not illusion, not mimicry. It was her. Mira, she said softly, voice barely above a breath. The two sisters ran to each other, and when they collided, it was real. Sam's body was warm, solid. Her hands clung to Mira like she'd been drowning and finally found something to hold on to. For a heartbeat, the horror of the place fell away, and Mira let herself believe. But the library doesn't give without asking something back. The aisle around them collapsed, not physically but conceptually. It rewrote itself. The shelves rearranged, the lights dimmed, and in the shadows, a figure appeared, tall, faceless, bound in the robes of an archivist. Its head was a lantern filled with swirling ink. The voice came not from its mouth but from the shelves, the pages, the air. The keeper must be chosen. One stays, one leaves. A name must be erased. Mira gripped Sam's hand tighter. No, she said. We both leave. The figure tilted slightly, amused. Then neither will remain. Sam looked up at her. Her voice shook. I remember now. I came here looking for answers. About what comes after. I wanted to see what no one could see. I opened something. Mira, I let it in. Mira shook her head. That wasn't your fault. Sam smiled faintly. It was curiosity, same as you. The entity stepped forward. Its presence was unbearable, like standing next to a void that hungered for identity. It raised a hand of ink and parchment, and a book appeared between them. Blank, but Mira knew what it was, the contract. She saw 2 lines inside, one labelled Mira Hawthorne, bound if signed, the other Samantha Hawthorne, erased if unsigned. Sam stared at it. You can go home, she said. You don't have to stay. I'm not leaving you, Mira said. Mira, but she wasn't listening. Her fingers hovered over the page. The pen was there already. The ink shimmered, not black but red. She could sign. Take Sam's place, become the new librarian, bear the memories, contain the hunger. It would devour her name slowly, make her forget who she was, one thought at a time. But it would let Sam go. She could save her. Elliot had made that choice. He was still here. She could too, couldn't she? But then, Mira did something the library hadn't anticipated. She closed the book. The air snapped, the corridor groaned, the shadows trembled. You said a name must be erased, she said. But what if it's not ours? The figure stilled, and Mira turned to Sam. What was its name? She whispered. The real one. The one you read in the forbidden stacks. The one that brought you here. Sam's eyes widened. The library froze. She stepped back, voice shaking. I remember. Mira, if we speak it. Mira nodded. We unwrite it. Sam stared at her for a long moment, then spoke, and Mira followed. They said it together, a name older than breath, older than language. A name so deep, so hidden, that even the entity had buried it from itself. The moment the name passed their lips, the figure convulsed. The shelves shrieked, the candles blew out one by one, the library screamed. It remembered what it was, and what it had once done to become this thing. And that remembering undid it. The aisle collapsed inward, not into rubble, but into blankness, erasure, memory stripped bare. The ink peeled from the walls, the bindings fell to the floor, the pages turned to ash. And then, silence. Real silence. True, blessed, terrifying silence. When Mira opened her eyes, she was lying in the grass. The sky above her was soft with morning. She sat up. The crater was gone. The ivy-covered scar on the campus lawn was just that. A shallow impression, filled now with flowers that hadn't been there yesterday. And beside her, breathing softly, Sam, alive, whole, eyes closed, but dreaming. Somewhere else, far beyond waking, a single candle burned. One book remained. It sat on a pedestal of stone in a space that was neither library nor void. And inside it, 2 names had been written. And then, erased. The rest of the pages were empty, waiting. The sunlight warmed Mira's face, but the air still felt heavy, like something vast had just shifted in the space around her. She sat there in the middle of the grassy campus, Sam's head resting gently on her lap, her sister breathing softly. The feeling of it, the relief, the exhaustion, the overwhelming sense of rightness, was strange, as though she had woken from a long, dark dream. A dream where nothing had felt real. A dream where the price of loss had been far higher than anything she had ever known. But now, here, in the calm of the morning, Mira could only feel the quiet and the certainty that she would never need to dream that way again. Sam stirred, blinking her eyes open as she awoke to the world. The warmth of the sun, the green of the grass, the sound of birds in the trees. Sam sat up, looking around with confusion for a moment, then locking eyes with Mira. Mira? She whispered, voice hoarse, like she had been sleeping for far longer than a night. Mira smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Sam's face. "You're really here." Sam's lips parted as if to speak, but then her gaze shifted to the ground beside them. Her expression faltered, something flickering behind her eyes. The words came slowly. I remember." Mira nodded, heart racing. "The library, you remember." Sam's hand found Mira's, gripping it tightly. "I remember everything. The library, the door, the bargain. It tried to take me. It almost did." Mira's pulse quickened. She had to know. "But how did we escape? How did we—" "We didn't," Sam said quietly, her eyes distant, lost in thought. "You unmade it. Not just the library, but everything. We called its name, and when it remembered, it had to forget. But it's still there, Mira." Mira looked at her, confused. "It's still there? The library?" Sam nodded slowly. "Not the building, not the place. It's a part of the world now, Mira. It's not confined to the walls anymore. But the hunger, it's not gone. It's waiting." Mira felt a chill run down her spine. She gripped Sam's hand tighter. "Waiting. For what?" "For the next name," Sam said softly. "It's always been about the names, the forgotten ones, the ones the world doesn't remember. You and I were never supposed to be part of it." Mira squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push away the terrifying implications of Sam's words. The library was gone. They were free. They had won. She had to believe that. They had to have won. But something still lingered in the air between them. Mira took a deep breath, gathering herself as if fighting the rising panic in her chest. "So, we're safe now, Sam. It can't touch us again, can it?" Sam didn't respond at first. She just stared at the grass, her fingers tracing the edge of a blade. Mira could feel the weight of her sister's silence, pressing against her chest like a stone. Finally, Sam spoke again, her voice soft and unsure. "It touched us. It touched us the moment we stepped into its story. We can't undo that." Mira opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to believe, she wanted to say that it was all over, that the library and the entity and everything tied to that night were gone. But deep down she knew what Sam meant. The library never truly let go of those it touched, and Mira had felt it. The pull, the hunger, the door that still waited for her somewhere, in the spaces between her thoughts, between breaths. It was there, beneath the surface, buried, but waiting. The hunger. It wasn't gone, and maybe that was the curse they would carry forever. Weeks passed, the campus returning to its usual rhythm. The memories of the library faded, like a dream upon waking, barely a ripple in the fabric of time. But Mira couldn't forget. Sam couldn't forget. They both knew the truth, even as the world around them moved on, blissfully unaware. Mira sat in the student union one afternoon, staring blankly at the book in front of her. It was a history text, something mundane and safe. She tried to focus on it, but her thoughts wandered, tracing back to the dreamlike feeling of the library, the door, the whispering names, the unanswered questions. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her stomach like lead. The door, the pages, the way the library waited. She forced herself to focus again, but it was harder now. It was like her mind was shifting, like something was trying to slip through the cracks. What if it was still out there? What if it wasn't done? What if it was still watching? Her phone buzzed. She looked down. A message. "Sam." I felt it again. Mira's. Fingers froze over her phone, heart hammering in her chest. She didn't need to ask, she already knew. Mira met Sam in the same place they had sat weeks ago, under the same tree where the world had seemed to shift. Sam's eyes were wide, filled with something Mira couldn't place, something familiar, something she had seen before. It came, "To me in my dream," Sam whispered, her voice cracking with the rawness of something she couldn't express. "The door. It called me again, Mira. Just like it did before." Mira felt her stomach drop, the weight of the words sinking into her, skin into her bones. She reached for Sam's hand, feeling the warmth in her sister's grip. But even that couldn't shake the growing unease. "What does it want, Sam?" "It doesn't want," Sam said softly. "It needs." Mira opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught. She could feel it too now, the pull, the ache of something ancient and hungry tugging at her heart. "We're not free," Sam said, as if reading her thoughts. "We never were." Mira closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the truth settle over her. The library had never been destroyed. The hunger was still there, and they were the ones it had chosen. In the distant corners of the world, in dark and forgotten places, there are whispers of a library that doesn't exist, where names go to be forgotten, where memories are erased, and where people are lost. And if you listen carefully sometimes, you can still hear the rustling of pages and the whisper of a